A man thrust his hand forward and shouted that this porter had been expelled from the squad called Wounds of Darkness, and the people around looked at Sei with contempt as he sat hunched on a chair with his hands on his knees. He looked straight ahead and thought he'd expected this. As a carrier, he had always been a burden to those on the front line under enemy fire. He remembered studying hard to keep up with the other adventurers and sitting at the same table with them. He never earned even a copper rank, and images of gold coins flashed through his mind. A young man had no combat skill but wanted to conquer the world. Reborn as a porter with a unique storage ability, he chose his dream over strength. Now he lay surrounded by several girls. Outside, the night was deep, and the dark sky glowed with the moon and scattered stars. Cries rang out through the house. On a bed in one room, a boy lay behind a girl who looked like a cat. A fair-haired young man held a girl with cat ears tightly, her face flushed red and their bodies pressed close together. Their lips met in a kiss as the boy and the girl continued to lie on the bed, and she cried out with pleasure, moaning loudly. A white splash dissolved into the air. The girl with cat ears lay in the young man's arms. He set the jug on the bedside table. Resting her head on his stomach, she admitted she loved Seiya. He watched her closely. The cat-eared girl with a ponytail settled on Sei's chest. She whispered that she wanted to stay with him forever. In the dark room, where moonlight poured through the large windows, the boy lay silent. Sei did not answer, and lowered his head. His thoughts kept returning to the stranger's question about whether he wanted to start a new life. The dark-haired youth lifted his head, shielding his face with his hand from the blinding light. Feathers fell from the sky. Sitting on the floor, he reached out and a woman's palm, adorned with bracelets, touched his hand. A man with long golden hair stood before the young man, spread his arms wide and smiled, and then offered him a choice between two paths. A table listing various attributes appeared before them. The dark-haired boy confidently pointed to the porter profession, turning down the title of hero. In the next moment, the young woman held a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, the baby sleeping peacefully, while the people around them were genuinely happy for the mother and child. The scene moved to a festive reception. A young woman in a lavish gown held a glass and watched the elegant guests. A floral headpiece sparkled in her hair. A huge chandelier lit the hall. A young blonde man in a suit with a rose on his lapel appeared. A crowd of girls gathered around him, their cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Smiling broadly, he returned their looks. Once again, a table of attributes appeared before everyone. Someone pressed the porter profession button. A strange, glowing ring lit up above the blonde man's head. The man in a business suit held a sword, and in a threatening voice said, "The boy must be buried secretly before anyone finds out that the Amberius family had produced someone of such a low profession." A young man with a glowing halo suddenly laughed. He said it was the first time in his life someone had willingly chosen the job of a porter. The frightened boy stared at the sword's blade as the man's smile slowly faded. A long-haired man whose hair hid his face grinned ominously and wished the boy luck with his transformation. Morning came as the sun rose high and its rays bathed the waking city. The girl with cat ears woke up, wrapped herself in a blanket, and got out of bed. The empty room greeted her with silence, and she looked around in confusion, searching for someone. Her eyes landed on the side table where 2 glasses, a jug, and some writing tools stood. A note lay there, too. She flinched when she saw it and quietly spoke someone's name. A fair-haired young man named Sai put on his jacket, his ear pierced and strands of hair falling over his face, and he silently apologized to Neonia as he walked away. A young man found himself in a room filled with weapons, bags, and clothing. He was determined to set out on a journey and become worthy of the one he was willing to change for. He moved his hand aside, and everything in the room vanished in an instant as wind lifted the heavy curtains by the large window and sunlight flooded the space with golden light. The boy pulled his hood up over his head. A rope with a strange charm hung around his neck. In his mind, he promised that when she grew up, they would go on a real journey together. The sun blazed in the sky. The town, set among mountains and hills, lay below, and behind it, a dense, distant forest stood dark and threatening. Sei walked a narrow path through the undergrowth. Not far off came the sound of hooves. Armed riders in heavy armor were approaching. One of them called to Sei, and he turned, hiding his face under his hood. Two riders stopped nearby. Sei said calmly that he could be useful to them. One of the men noted that it was too reckless to walk here unarmed. Their surprised looks turned to him. He fell silent and turned away. The hood and his hair hid his face. One of the riders examined Seiya's pendant and said it really marked him as a carrier. The pendant was carved with hands holding a pouch and strange inscriptions. He lifted his head slightly. His face stayed hidden, and he confirmed he was traveling from Magda to Amberius with cargo, adding confidently that he trusted his escape skills and did not need an escort. One of the men in a feathered helmet held the lead firmly and said the chance of encountering a monster was small, since he and his partner patrol this road and usually deal with threats first. Suddenly, his voice went cold and condescending. He added that the chance of meeting bandits still existed. Sei listened silently, head lowered, without interrupting. The next moment, the helmeted rider reached for his weapon. Sei noticed the movement and drew his own blade, tense and waiting to see what came next. The man simply led his horse forward and told Sei to be more careful on this road. Sei nodded briefly in agreement and, with a slight tilt of his head, replied to the rider while watching them go. He smiled and waved goodbye. Then a moment later his face went serious as he lowered his hand and pulled his hood up, letting strands of hair fall out. Dark treetops loomed over the road, and mountains rose behind them. One of the riders quietly asked his companion if they had done the right thing by letting the boy go, since he seemed too suspicious. The second man tilted his head and guessed he might be a scout for the gang hunting the merchant convoy. The rider ahead picked up the pace warily. Another man just smiled and waved him off, saying this guy was only a porter, the lowest profession with meager stats and the slowest growth. He gave a nervous twitch when he heard them and adjusted his hood. The rider, still mocking, said that even if this boy were tied to the robbers, he would be of no use, since he belonged to a peaceful profession. Riders on horseback said porters have a knack for keeping things that could be used for crimes or revenge, but they were still barred from entering important institutions, and this one was heading in a completely different direction. Sei kept walking along the road through the gloomy forest, pulled back his hood and looked around with something in his hands, while someone else's words echoed in his head that porters were among the weakest people in the world. Soon he reached a hill overlooking a small town. The wind whipped his cloak and scarf. The town sat in a low forest and was ringed by tall mountains. Sunlight streamed onto the city's buildings, each different in shape and appearance. The streets buzzed with crowds. There were so many that the noise never stopped. A girl stood by a brick wall. A pretty stone in her necklace shone on her chest. Nearby men jeered and used crude language as a few strangers began to harass her. A short young woman stood surrounded by several grim men, her face burning with fear and shame, fair hair slipping from under her hood as she clutched her hands to her chest for protection. Men watched her with predatory smiles. They pretended to be friendly, saying they could take her to a great place. They pressed her to go with them, promising to tell her everything about the city. Sei was walking down a street, blending into the crowd, when he noticed several men pressing a short girl against a wall and blocking her path. He stopped in the middle of the street, close to where the girl was pinned against a brick wall by a group of men. The girl brought her hands to her face and tried to speak but did not dare. The men insisted that she go with them. Sei stood aside and watched quietly. Hands clasped and cheeks flushed, she said with excitement that the men's offer sounded very tempting, and for the first time in this town she was genuinely eager to hear about him. Hearing those words, Sei's face changed. His eyes narrowed, and from beneath his hood he gave the girl and the men a sharp, reproachful look. The inside of the hood was lined with soft fur. The men's faces flushed red, and their smiles grew even nastier. They took the girl's hands and led her on while hurriedly explaining something to her. Sei put his hands in his pockets and watched them go in silence. He was about to leave, but suddenly stopped and thought aloud that the girl seemed too carefree, innocent and naive, possibly the daughter of some noble, while people walked by without paying attention. Sei smiled, lifted his head and closed his eyes. He muttered that those men were making a ridiculous attempt to woo her. No one would really believe such cheap lies. It did not concern him at all. Suddenly he remembered another girl, covered in blood, lying on the ground and gently touching his face. The memory abruptly changed Seiya's expression. His smile disappeared and his face went dark. He stayed standing in the middle of the stone street, cobblestones under his feet. People hurried past without noticing him. A window on one house opened right onto the roof. Sei stood directly opposite that house, paused and lost in thought. The men took the girl aside to an abandoned house. Its windows were smashed and the walls were cracked. Leaning trees grew nearby. She stepped in first, gripping the strap of her small bag, and nervously said she was curious what might be inside the house, while the men who followed promised a surprise awaited her and that she would now tell them everything. A sinister smile spread across the men's faces. They firmly barred the door with a thick board, then slowly moved toward the girl who stood with her back to them. Only a single dim light burned in the dark room. They grabbed the young woman and lifted her horizontally so her underwear peeked out from under her clothes, and one of them began unbuttoning his pants, saying coldly that her skin was too tempting, and it was time for her to serve him. In an instant, the man's face twisted with pain. His eyes rolled back and saliva sprayed from his mouth. The other bandits froze, unsure what had happened to him. A boy stood behind him. Sei struck the man right between the legs. The man doubled over and dropped the girl. The others stared, stunned by Sei's sudden appearance and even feeling fear. Sei stood behind, hands in his pockets, his face expressionless. The man he had hit writhed on the floor, and the others looked at the newcomer with anger and confusion. The blonde shouted for an explanation, but the next moment Sei grabbed him by the clothes. Sweat dotted the frightened man's face, and he had not expected such strength and boldness. With a sudden move, Sei knocked him to the floor. The man's body hit the floor with a dull thud, and his face twisted in sharp pain. Sei wrapped his hand around the man's throat and pressed a knife to his neck. In a cold voice, he told the others to step back or the blonde would get hurt. The victim stared at the blade in horror. A bald, bare-chested man stepped forward smiling, his hands raised, a weapon hidden behind his back and a bag hanging at his side. Mockingly, he said that Sei was acting like a knight rescuing a princess, and it looked impressive, while making it clear that he was the real leader here. The bald man smiled even wider and told the boy to calm down, saying it was more important to save all his people than a random person from the street. Meanwhile, the dark-haired man and the beast man held the girl, who was already lying on the floor. An old cracked ceiling loomed above. The bald man muttered with feigned regret that he was sorry his men had touched Sei's friend. With his hands raised over his head, he still smiled and apologized for his young, hot-headed subordinates, calling them too inexperienced. A bag dangled from his shoulder. Sei, holding a knife to the blonde's throat, said calmly that they must let the girl go. Only then would he release the hostage. Behind him, the bandits' silhouettes loomed. The bald man kept smiling and pretending to agree. Then his face darkened, and he sneered that the subordinate was so frightened he might wet himself, which was not something to show others. Sei gave him a serious look. The blonde he held had tears in his eyes and looked away, not understanding what was happening. The next moment, the bald man was behind Sei. Armed, he swung, then vanished and reappeared beside the blonde. His crushing blow tore him to pieces, blood and body scattering across the room. The bandits standing to the side flinched. One of them sneered as the blond man's innards splattered even onto the walls. On the floor lay a blood stain and the weapon that had fallen from his hands. The bald man grinned and said that before you try to save someone, you must carefully assess your opponent's strength. Sei answered briefly that he agreed. The bald man glanced his way, but at that moment heard a voice behind him. Sei had already moved away from the bandits, holding the girl in his arms and hiding his face under a hood. The bald one turned away and sneered that the boy's legs were lightning fast. The other thugs were shocked by his reaction. Sei stood up, supporting the girl's back, and quietly asked if she could stand. She nodded. The bald man with a scar on his face squinted and looked at Sei suspiciously, saying he was probably the girl's real guard, and Sei, hiding his face under his hair, said it didn't matter now. Trembling, the girl folded her hands and stood behind Sei. He stepped forward, took a fighting stance, and declared that although he was a porter, he was really an adventurer. The dark-haired man was kicked in the face by the girl and cried out in pain. The other bandits grabbed her legs and mocked that although she was strong, her level was too low because she had only just come of age. One of the thugs grabbed the girl, leaned his face close to hers, and said, They knew how to handle situations like this, while the others laughed and joined in his insults. Several bandits stared at Sei in disbelief. Sure, he could not be only a porter, since that was seen as the weakest job. Yet he stood calmly holding the cloak while the girl hid behind him. One of them laughed, and soon everyone began to mock him, saying the boy was too foolish and did not know his place. They laughed at what he did while he remained silent and listened closely. His face remained cold and focused. Sei activated his analysis ability. Several wooden beams ran across the ceiling. One of the bandits said they could have fun with the girl later and should deal with him first. He sized them up. 2 of the 4 were armed. One wore a cloak and was a level 17 assassin. The other a level 15 swordsman. The third was a level 10 boxer. The fourth a level 20 warrior. One of them licked his blade and hissed that this scoundrel who did not know his place would be a test for his twin blade, and that he would regret meeting them. Sei simply closed his eyes and sighed heavily. He replied calmly that nothing in this world is more important than a profession. Strong professions make people almost unbeatable, while weak ones are doomed to become victims. Going up against them with only a porter's trade is a challenge to oneself. The girl stood stunned, staring ahead with her arms folded over her chest. The bandits gave her grim looks, armed themselves and slowly reached out as they prepared to fight. Sei put one hand on his belt, scratched the back of his head with the other, smiled slightly, and said that despite everything these people would lose to him, the weakest of them all. He touched his face, smiled cruelly, and said they should have known that losing to him would leave them even lower than Sei himself. His jacket was open and fur was poking out from under the hood. The blonde shouted and swung at Sei. Sei held out his nunchaku, and the bandit's blade sank straight into them. He kicked sharply, knocking the attacker aside, then assumed a fighting stance. The blonde stared at his hand in horror as his sword vanished, trembling as he pointed at Sei and shouted that his weapon was gone while the one-eyed beast rushed forward, accusing Sei of using a storage skill. The one-eyed man shouted for everyone to attack at once. All the bandits rushed at Seiya, waving their weapons with rage on their faces. Someone tried to grab him, but Sei dodged and counterattacked them one by one, and the one-eyed man took a blow to the face and was knocked back, shouting. The one-eyed beast lay on its side with a fierce grimace, staring at Sei, who had just struck it. Its gaze burned with fury and resentment. A moment later, the bandit wearing an overturned helmet gaped in surprise as something flew toward him. Seji's blow sent the helmet to one side. The bandit raced around the room, shouting that he couldn't see. He tried to take a fighting stance, but an armed opponent was already waiting behind him. A hooded thug stuck out his tongue and bared his teeth, clutching a knife to stab Sei from behind. But Sei saw the danger and an iron chain appeared in his hands. The hooded thug lunged forward, but Sei dodged. The attacker was stunned and didn't even realize how Sei slipped away. A long iron chain began to coil around them. Sei yanked the chain sharply, catching the hooded attacker. Sliding across the floor, he pulled and the thug ended up behind him while another enemy tried to attack from the front, reaching out with a broken arm. Sei grabbed the dark-haired bandit's head and slammed it into the floor, then sprang aside as a chain reappeared in his hands and the bandits began to get up, shouting. As they rose, a giant shadow fell over them. They all flinched and looked up at a towering stone statue wrapped in iron chains. One of the hooded thugs realized a chain was gripping his arm tightly. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stared at his limb in shock. The statue, wrapped in chains, hit the floor with a dull thud, dragging a hooded bandit with it. He fell with it, trying to brace himself on his leg. A bald man suddenly appeared behind Sei and swung his weapon. Sei sensed the danger, and at the last moment raised his wooden shield. The weapon struck it with terrible force. Li Siai pushed forward, gripping his weapon, and Seiya was thrown back by the blow. The shield shattered, and Seiya's body crashed into a stone statue. A cloud of dust filled the room. Twisting in midair, he closed one eye and folded his arms. A huge mattress suddenly appeared in front of the wall. He struck the mattress instead of the rock, saved by his own magic. Sei fell to the floor and began to get up while the bald man came at him with a heavy hammer, taunting that no one survives relying on those skills because brute strength rules. He stopped, smiled, and said the room looked cleaner than usual. It was because Sei had used his storage ability before the fight. Clouds of dust rose behind him. Sei knelt, rubbing his face with his hand while the other leaned on the floor, and a mattress still lay behind them. The bald man smiled and said porters of that caliber are rare, but this one was still too weak. The bald man grinned more cruelly. Veins bulged across his body, and a panel appeared beside him, showing his profession, a level 30 warrior. And he said he would now show the true difference between them. At that moment, Sei reached out and a large stone block appeared before him. The bald attacker's head came to rest a few meters from Sei. Sei darted aside. The next strike shattered the stone brick into fragments. Debris flew up, and the bald man moved forward, never taking his eyes off the boy. Sei watched calmly as the dust from the broken brick cleared, and several sacks labeled flour appeared in front of the bald man. Lisi swung and smashed the sacks with a heavy hammer, and a cloud of flour dust rose into the air, filling the room. Gritting his teeth, he looked around and snarled that such childish tricks wouldn't work. He suspected Sei was trying to escape, but a moment later, several more sacks of flour flew straight at him. The bald man kept swinging the hammer and smashing sacks of flour, sending up clouds of dust, and Sei said calmly that he had done it on purpose to drive him right here. Lisi grew even more furious, veins bulging on his face and cracks spreading through the wall from his blow. Sei said coldly that this was the gang's lair, a former warehouse built of fireproof materials. The warehouse windows were boarded up. Sei said he'd made small changes to the room, cutting the airflow to set a trap. He stood by one of the boards, holding a burning flame in his hand, and aimed it into a small hole. The room was filled with flour dust. Sei said coldly that it would be interesting to see what would happen if they used fire here. The fox shouted that it was nonsense and hid behind a huge statue that looked like a chicken, while Sei kept one hand in his pocket and held the other to the side. A powerful explosion sounded behind. Flames tore the air, and Sei, without looking back, walked forward slowly, saying the man would die, never having understood his words. He stepped toward the girl sitting on the floor with wide, surprised eyes. Thick smoke was already filling the room. Sei reached out to the girl and asked if she was okay. Answering that she was, she took his hand. Sei activated his ability, and a table with her stats appeared nearby, showing she was a nun. Sei was surprised to see the name Runa Amelia Taltwalt. He pulled up his hood and warned the girl firmly not to trust strangers. Putting his hand into his pocket, he waved goodbye with the other and began to walk away. The girl tightened her grip on her suitcase and called out for him to wait. Smoke in the room grew thicker. Sei went to the door, cracked it open, and said there were already enough curious onlookers, so she should hurry and leave. People appeared on the street. The door creaked, and Sei disappeared into the darkness. The girl stood frozen, her hand raised and her face full of confusion. Night fell. Lights came on in the windows of the apartment building. Inside, a woman in a sheer outfit with a headpiece was dancing. Sei and the other men sat at wooden tables with mugs and plates. A girl in sheer clothing turned her back to Seiya. He couldn't help looking at her slim figure as he held a wooden mug with a drink, lost in thought. Setting the mug of frothy drink on the table, he realized the rescued girl had a surname, so she was from an aristocratic family. In his imagination, Runa smiled and touched his hand. Sei decided she was too trusting, probably raised with her parents' love and care. He lifted the mug again and took a sip, thinking it best to keep his distance from her until he knew who she was with. Holding a mug near his face, he listened with one ear to Runa and the mustached man talking. The girl said she was on a monastery mission and could treat any wounds for free. Sei stood up and went to her, asked if she was all right, and Runa turned with flushed cheeks, saying he was indeed the boy who had saved her. The mustached man gave her a sly look and said she only wanted a free room. In his grandfather's day monastery, missions were common, but now they are rare. The girl agreed. Not wanting to argue with the church, he offered the girl a bed in a 6-person room. Runa thanked him, and the man said he owned the place. A scene flashed before Seiya. Runa in her nightgown, hair messy, surrounded by several men touching her. Placing a coin with a woman's image on the bar, he said firmly he would pay for a private room for her. Runa looked surprised, and the owner thanked Sei. Sei stepped away from the bar and heard Runa thank him again. He turned and said it was nothing. Turning away, he added quietly that a priest had once saved his life, and now he was simply repaying a small debt. With one hand in his pocket, he stood up and lifted the other to say goodbye to his comrade. Runa stopped him, calling out anxiously. Blushing, she introduced herself as Runa Amelia Taltfalt, a nun of the Holy Order. She wanted to repay him for his rescue. Say looked at her and also gave his name. Then he turned away and walked off. Runa bowed, and he returned to his seat and continued drinking from his mug. The girl stayed at the counter next to the mustached man. He wiped a mug with a towel and suddenly shouted that the girl was just trying to eat for free and should stop begging. Runa calmly repeated that she was on a monastery mission. Two strange men entered the place. Their faces were flushed and drool ran from their mouths as soon as they saw Runa. The men approached Runa and rudely told her she could treat them, promising they would feed and help her in return. Grateful, she thanked them for their generosity. Say heard the conversation. He slammed his mug on the table and stood up sharply. Moments later, he was at the bar where Runa sat among unfamiliar men, and she looked at his back in surprise. Say turned to her with a small smile, though a hidden anger burned in his eyes, and he asked if Runa would join him for dinner, a mug in his hand and a fur hood resting on his shoulder. Runa folded her hands as a blush spread across her face, then said eagerly that she would be happy to join him. The girl sat in a soft armchair by the bar. Meanwhile, the girl in a sheer dress kept dancing, smiling sweetly at the guests, with jewelry glittering on her head and hands. The hall was crowded, and the tables groaned under dishes and snacks. Curious, Runa asked if Say was carrying out a task right now. He calmly held a mug and replied that he was not on a mission now, but was heading to the Lotus in Linkalu. They sat by the bar. Runa said cheerfully that she also needed to go to Lotus. Say replied briefly that he understood. Nearby, mustached men sat eating their food. Smiling, she explained she was on a monastery mission and wanted to gather a team to go through the Lotus Labyrinth. Their paths may have crossed. Say squinted and agreed. With his mug raised, he said the town could use a porter. Runa held the utensils, her mouth full of food, and agreed. Crumbs clung to her flushed face as she looked at the plate of vegetables and meat and, embarrassed, apologized. Runa clenched her fists and said it was probably a sign from above. She had been given a chance to travel with a companion. Say watched her closely, holding a mug. She raised her hands and looked him steadily in the eye, saying that if he did not mind, they could go together, which surprised him as he felt her firm gaze. Quietly turning a mug in his hands, he thought. His hair was slightly tousled, and his thoughts were muddled. Finally, he lifted his mug, closed his eyes, and said that if Runa could endure the hardships, he would accept her proposal, and she broke into a happy smile. Say raised a finger at Rune and said he was a commoner, so she could not address him formally, and she answered awkwardly that she owed him a great deal and would have to rely on him from now on. His expression shifted to a slight frown, as he admitted she was really serious. Hearing that, Runa closed her eyes and smiled softly. Say paused briefly and gave her the same smile. They sat at the bar. The girl listened closely to every word he said. Say raised his hand and said something while keeping his gaze on her. Runa touched his shoulder. He propped his chin on one hand, pointed to the side with the other, then looked at her with a slight smile. She covered her mouth and laughed. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the exit. A lamp with a candle hung by the door. Say waved goodbye and she smiled warmly. Night spread over the town, lit by the moon and stars. In the room, wooden doors were closing. A wooden basin sat on the table and a clean towel lay beside it. Drops of water ran down Saya's face as he let out a heavy sigh. Shirtless and wearing only trousers, he raised his hand and balls of fire and water formed in his palm. The heated water slowly poured into a wooden basin. Wiping himself with a wet rag, he thought that even while bathing he was practicing magic and improving his storage skill. A flame burned in his hand, and a droplet of water rose above it as it heated. He squeezed the rag, wringing out the water after washing. Say stood by a table with a wooden basin, a neatly made bed behind him. Snapping his fingers, his clothes vanished instantly. Looking at the water, he noted that even at rest he kept training. It was the only way to survive in such a weak profession. With a heavy sigh, he said he could no longer go on. He hugged himself and admitted to himself that he felt intense excitement. To calm himself, he started using a self-healing technique. His breathing deepened. He pictured Runa's curves and her gentle smile. Life without a woman felt like real hell to him. Someone knocked on the door to his room. Sei opened his eyes and looked at them. Completely naked, he walked over, grabbed the handle, and prepared to open it. A dancer from the club where Sei had dinner with Runa stood in the doorway. She smiled, introduced herself as Manaya, and said she worked there as a dancer. The girl walked up and hugged Seiya, joking that it was boring to sleep alone in a room so luxurious, and she added that she had seen him watching her that evening in the hall. Leaning against him, she whispered that the night together could be truly special. Her gaze fell on the pendant he wore on his neck, and surprise filled her eyes. Holding his arm, she said he was really just a porter, though she'd thought he was a hero because he had paid for that nun's room. She even added that she wanted to have his child. Sei gave a tired look as the girl began to undress. Smiling, she said, "The trade runs in the family, and she would not want that kind of future for her children," and his gaze stayed guarded. Soon she lay on the bed, arms thrown back, moaning with pleasure as he touched her body, and she cried out that she was feeling this for the first time in her life. They were on the bed. She knelt, and he stood behind her holding her hips. She stuck out her tongue and moaned with pleasure. A white splash burst into the air. He lifted her. Another blast ripped through the air. Then he let go. She fell onto the bed and cried out that she was losing her mind and could not bear it anymore. Sei closed his eyes, put his hands behind his head and smiled, saying she gave up so easily, realizing he had found her weakness and deciding to push even harder. His hands returned to her thighs. She stuck out her tongue and begged him to stop, but he said it was too early to rest. Lifting her, he hugged her again, touching every part of her body. She cried out with pleasure, and he, standing behind her, just smiled. Morning replaced the night. The sun rose slowly and lit the roofs of the city buildings. The bed lay covered in a strange liquid. Sei stood naked by the large window with the wind tossing his hair, the morning quiet, and he called out loudly that the dawn was truly beautiful, while a girl lay on the bed with her mouth open as he urged her to look at the beauty outside the window. Standing at the open window, fully naked, he smiled and said he wanted to relive the night one more time before moving on. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky. Lush tree canopies rose all around, and the town lay hidden among the hills. Runa raised her fist, her face flushed and her eyes bright with enthusiasm, while Sei sat behind her smiling as he watched. The wagon wheels creaked, and the travelers set off. Sei and Runa sat in the wagon with a few others. One slept, another read, and the rest discussed how to reach their destination faster. The cart moved along a narrow path through a field. Ahead stood a dense spruce forest, and tall mountains rose beyond it. Runa leaned on the edge of the cart, smiled at Sei, and said she was grateful because he had paid for the trip. Sei gave her a suspicious look and said she probably has a plan to travel for free. He wondered how she had not been caught yet. She admitted he was right. His expression changed when he turned his gaze from the girl to the window. At the window, he saw a scene that filled him with surprise and admiration. Before him stretched a panorama of the city, enclosed by high stone walls, beyond which lay a dark, dense forest. Runa gripped the wagon's edge and watched Sei pull his hood off. He set it down and smiled easily. Runa looked at him in surprise, her cheeks flushing a brighter pink. They reached a large wooden house where many people had gathered and other wagons were parked nearby. Runa noticed that Sei was no longer hiding his face. He said he hadn't wanted to be recognized. Startled, she asked if he had hurt anyone. Sei put his hands in his jacket pockets and said he wanted to ask her a few questions. He looked at her and calmly said she must tell him about the monastic mission she keeps mentioning. The smiling rune began to explain that this is the path for those God has called to be monks. They travel the world, heal the sick, and fight monsters. Folding her hands, she looked up and pictured a girl in a nun's robe holding a weapon, and the rune said her goal was to raise her level and become a priestess instead of a monk. On the porch of a wooden house, they sat at a table with a tray of food. Runa smiled and said that, under God's protection, she and her companions were looking for adventure while helping each other. Rune folded her hands and closed her eyes. She said it all felt like a story about a holy woman who went on a monastic mission. Sei took a bite of his sandwich and asked for more details, and Runa smiled as she continued, explaining it was a biography she had read many times. She spread out a map of fields, forests, lakes, and mountains, and said she had traveled widely, healing those in need, fighting monsters and moving on. He and Sei stood on the veranda and looked at the lovely view. They talked about how everyone improves in their own way. Mountains and the lush crowns of trees stretched out ahead of them. Runa said her family was not well off, so they could not afford to hire guards when they moved. She looked ahead and said that, like the saint in the book, she wanted to gather a party and go into the dungeon, because she needed a purpose in life. Sei leaned on the railing, watched Runa closely, then turned away and said he was only a porter. He laughed and said he didn't want to live within limits. Heroes and warriors are strong, but their lives are ruined by expectations and the burden of responsibility. Runa looked at him in surprise. They looked at the mountains. Sei reached out and said the world is too big to live in chains. He wants to be strong, but not necessarily the strongest. With his hand raised and fist clenched, he smiled and said he wanted to live on his own terms and travel the world. They walked the city's crowded streets. Runa went ahead with a smile, and Sei walked a little behind, also wearing a faint smile. Soon they reached a pond. Runa took off her shoes and waded in up to her ankles. A fish swam at her feet, and she watched it with delight. Sei moved up to her and stepped into the water too. Runa slipped and nearly fell as the people on the shore watched her. He managed to grab her hands and lift her. Leaning against him, she smiled apologetically. Runa was drenched, her chest pressed against Sei's body. Sei flinched and looked at her with a grim expression. The sun set behind the mountains. The sky slowly darkened, and birds flew over the rooftops. Saying goodbye to Runa, Sei felt a strange unease, his body trembling and sweat beading on his face as he walked down the street and saw women's silhouettes in a dark alley. His eyes fell on the girls wearing revealing clothes, their faces flushed. One of them began to take off her clothes. He became cautious and thoughtful. I cannot rewrite content that depicts sexual or non-consensual acts. Morning arrived. The sun rose high, shining on the roofs and the trees' green crowns. Runa stepped outside. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes turned away, and she smiled broadly. Sei approached and greeted her. They climbed into the wagon and set off along the wide road, a new town already visible on the horizon with tall mountains rising beyond it. They rode into a town where the houses stood close together. People crowded the narrow, winding streets. The town sat on hills, so there were stairways everywhere. Shops selling household goods lined one street, while oddly dressed people with unusual facial features walked by. Sei held a sandwich, took a bite, and said they would soon be in the city of Lotus. Runa reached out to take a piece and asked if he had been to the Lotus before. Sei closed his eyes and said no, but he could feel it in the very air. He remembered people in strange outfits and heavy armor that looked threatening. Sei said they looked like adventurers but were afraid of each other. With a sandwich in one hand and his other hand in his pocket, he said they were 100% adventurers trying to raise their rank to bronze, and Runa listened shyly. They approached the wagon. Runa said he was extremely attentive. Sei replied that his skill at observing was the only guarantee of survival. Settling into the wagon, he added that truly powerful adventurers are marked by their aura and that he can sense it at once. Settling into the carriage, he closed his eyes and realized even a commoner could feel it. Squinting slightly, he looked away and was surprised to see a girl beside him in unusual clothing. Two other female adventurers sat in the carriage, a blonde in a short outfit with a cloak over her shoulders, and a dark-haired woman covering one eye with her hand. Sei crossed his legs, folded his arms over his chest, and noted that everything around seemed fine. Runamilia asked if those people could be stronger than the adventurers. A blonde in a short outfit crossed her legs gracefully, long stockings visible beneath her suit. A third girl sat in the carriage with them, a bow from her blouse on her chest and a ribbon tied around her waist. The boa, having not heard the question, looked at the girls, blushed, and said they were dressed quite strikingly. Runamilia replied that gear also boosts strength. The carriage lurched along the uneven road. Sei noticed they needed to take a closer look. Runamilia agreed and said she still had much to learn from him. At last they reached a tall wooden building with flags and signs showing dishes and food. Fluffy clouds drifted above the roof. A wooden mug of frothy drink with a slice of lemon stood on the table, with a few plates nearby. A dark-haired girl called out that everything here tasted surprisingly good. She set down her mug, raised a finger, and said she wanted a refill. A waitress stood nearby as Sei fell into thought. Then he raised a finger and said a real adventurer must be able to sense danger coming. Sei and Runamilia sat at the table. He raised his hand and reminded her she had left her things in the carriage. Runamilia looked up and confirmed. She remembered the coachman seemed pleasant and had promised to look after her things himself, and Sei's expression changed as he said that was exactly what he had warned against. Stern men sat at the next table. One of them said Runamilia would meet many confident adventurers on her way, including some dangerous ones. In the other corner sat more sullen warriors in armor. A suitcase lay beside them. Sei added not to trust the coachman so easily, and to keep their belongings with them. He pushed his chair back, spread his hands, and said he was a carrier. If he stole things, he could not use them, and that was his exception. At another table, a man in a long coat kept a suitcase at his side. It was noted that people who keep their things nearby are always on guard. A hunting knife jutted from under the man's cloak at his belt. He warned that if anyone touched his property, he would immediately draw his weapon. Resting his chin on his hand, he warned Runamilia that if she relaxed, her belongings would vanish at once. In this world, money matters too much and people will do anything for it. Sei looked at the girl suspiciously. Her hand went to her face as she realized he was saying really frightening things. Leaning back in his chair, he said, "You should not trust strangers so quickly." Sei sat up straighter, smiled slightly, and said he could give one reason why he hides his face. Runamilia stared at him intently. Sei put his hands on his head, pulled a terrible face, stepped closer, and shouted that he might be a robber, or even a worse monster. Runamilia covered her mouth with her hand and laughed, then unexpectedly passed gas. Sei was stunned by her reaction, and lowered his hands in confusion. Squinting, she smiled and said it really was a monster, because she was so frightened she didn't know what to do next. Sei slowly lowered his hands, looked surprised, and thought Runamilia hopeless. She truly was a nobleman's daughter who knew nothing about people's evil intentions. He turned away, leaned on the table, and realized her innocence would sooner or later get her into trouble. If he wanted her to grow up, she had to go through real fear. Sei sighed, thinking he only needed a chance. Then they saw a bandit approach the wagon, distract the coachman, grab a weapon and strike him, knocking him to the ground. A robber snatches the suitcase and runs off with a predatory grin. The coachman is sprawled on the stones, gets up and starts shouting that it's a thief. Sei set his hand on the back of the wooden chair and watched in surprise as Runamilia sat beside him, mouth open and eyes wide, and dropped her sandwich in shock. A man with a bandage over his head and eyes grinned menacingly and bolted, taking several suitcases from Sei and Runamilia's cart. The coachman, his head bruised, watched the thief go and shouted, pointing forward that the thief had taken Runamilia's suitcase, while Runamilia trembled, raised the alarm, and beads of sweat formed on her face. The thief ran at full speed, clutching a suitcase with two clasps in his hand. Runamilia screamed frantically that they were really her things. Sei rose from the table and looked out the window, saying it was probably already too late to chase, and at that moment a loud rumble came from outside. Sei looked at tearful Runamilia and thought he could catch the thief quickly, but this was a great chance to teach her some common sense, since the suitcase clearly held something very important to her. Amelia covered her face with her hands, and tears rolled between her fingers. Sei thought that by trusting the coachman she had left something valuable in the wagon, and now had to learn an important lesson. Tears soaked Runamilia's face as she sobbed, pressing her hands against it and looking at Sei, desperate and pleading. Sei looked at her, then looked ahead, thought for a moment, and said that Runamilia should wait for him here. He opened the window and jumped through it, saying he would be back in a moment. The wind tossed his hair and cloak as he disappeared outside. The thief sped down a narrow alley, and Sei, walking along the parallel street with an impassive expression, almost caught up to him. Sei spotted a thief with a mask and realized that fleeing through the narrow alley gave him the advantage, so a moment's delay would let him slip away. A moment later, a girl stepped into the thief's path, and he shouted angrily, demanding that she get out of the way. The girl turned back to him. Sei, watching from the side, saw her set the bag of groceries on a crate and crouch to pick up a few small pebbles. After setting her foot aside, The girl began tossing pebbles, and Sei activated his ability to read attributes and was stunned by what he discovered. The wind blew her hair and a serious look settled in her eyes. Sei read her name. Zofie, 16, profession, assassin, level 12. Zofie swung and threw a pebble at the thief. It hit him right in the leg. The thief hopped on one leg, groaning in pain but not letting go of his loot, and stopped beside a wooden crate of buckets. Zofie still had one pebble in her hand, and she threw it at the robber a second time. A stone hurtled into the thief's face. A tooth flew out of his mouth, and he, with the loot, crashed into the crate, scattering the buckets. The bandit lay for a few seconds, kicking up clouds of dust, then suddenly scrambled to his feet and ran off again, shouting that he would not give up so easily. Passers-by stopped to watch. Sei kept chasing after her and noticed that the young female assassin's throwing skill was surprisingly high. He raced down a crowded street. Two men watched the chase, one of them with a mustache. A girl holding a staff told them to step aside. A dark-haired girl in a hood held a glowing staff in one hand and a wooden mug in the other. Her magic stirred up a gust of wind, and the people nearby hurried out of the way. A frightened look appeared on the thief's face, sweat running down as he clutched a few stolen items. Without warning, his feet left the ground and he hung in the air, clutching what he'd caught and shouting that he didn't understand what was happening. Debris and stones rose into the air with him. The dark-haired girl pointed her staff forward and said this thief had just ruined her tea. The next moment, a roar filled the air and everything around flared up and spun into a whirlwind. A girl with a staff that threw off sparks squinted one eye and said the thief must disappear, and his face twisted in terror as he was swept into a whirlwind, dropping several items. The thief, drenched in sweat, mouth agape and with a knocked-out tooth, screamed at the top of his lungs as he was swept up in a merciless hurricane. Sei activated his ability and smiled, noting the girl had excellent control of magic, and a loud thud came from the roof as the thief fell straight onto the tiles. Sei looked to the side in surprise and said the girl had managed to hold back the tornado's power so it would not destroy everything around, but that left him lacking the destructive force he needed. The dark-haired girl turned away, holding a wooden mug. A few men stood in front of her, sweat shining on their faces. One of them shouted nervously that the thief could still get away. The thief ran across the roof with the stolen goods, and Sei watched him, saying grimly that the thief was forcing him to waste time and energy. Sei's cloak and hair whipped in the gusts of wind. A short-haired blonde who used to toss pebbles stood behind Sei, watching him closely to gauge his true power. Sei adjusted his hood, smiled, and said there were too many people in the street, but it was already the end for the thief. Smoke and flashes of lightning rose from beneath his feet. Grinning widely, Sei lunged forward, activated his flash step, and ran across the rooftops while his shadow slipped under the cart and began chasing the thief on the ground. A narrow alley led him up, and he scrambled onto a roof where a thief stood on one leg, clutching the stolen goods. He vaulted onto the roof, planted his hands and feet to push off, and reached forward. The next moment, a crossbow appeared in his palms and a rope bolt shot out. The thief raced across the roof, clutching a suitcase when Sei lowered a rope above him. Startled, he looked up and froze. Sei closed in on him and gave a sinister smile, baring white teeth as the fur on his hood fluttered in the wind. "Outpacing the thief," Sei said with a cold glint in his eyes that you should not underestimate a carrier's trade. Sweat beaded on the thief's brow and his mouth twisted into a cry of horror. At that instant, Sei thrust his foot forward and, with a low spin, sent a bright glow from the sole. His blow knocked the thief off balance, and he fell screaming, still desperately clutching the suitcase. The thief shut his eyes, then heard a sharp ring and opened them. A black stone shackle glinted on his ankle, stopping his movements. He hit the ground without dropping his loot. Sei's body tore through a wooden crate, scattering splinters. He landed smoothly in a crouch, his cloak and hair swaying in the wind. The thief writhed on the broken crate, groaning in pain but still gripping the suitcase. Meanwhile, Sei approached him slowly. A dark shadow fell over the thief. His face, slick with sweat and marked by scratches, contorted with fear. He gaped, a knocked-out tooth sticking out of his mouth. Sei's face was grim, and his eyes glowed with cold light. Standing over the thief, he said the chase was over if the man did not want to die. His glare grew fiercer, and he demanded the suitcase be handed over immediately. The thief, with an iron shackle on his leg, clutched the loot convulsively to himself. He suddenly lost his temper and threw the suitcase at the wall. The act stunned Sei. The next instant, sharp metal blades flashed in the thief's hands. He began quickly unscrewing the nuts on the shackles, and bolts fell to the floor. The lock clicked open. Sei looked at it, stunned. The thief broke free from his bonds and darted forward. That man stood silently, watching dust rise into the air. Grinning ominously, the thief said it was time to say goodbye and that Sei was wrong to think he could catch him. His words stopped abruptly. The next moment he was face down with his rear in the air as Sei's foot pinned him to the ground. Sparks flew from it, kicking up a cloud of dust. Glowering at the thief, he thought the man had only added more work for him. A crowd had already gathered around, watching the scene. Sei lifted the suitcase beside him. The lock opened easily, and he decided that despite the many thieves in the world, he must return at least Runamilia's belongings. Just as he lifted the suitcase, things began spilling out through the broken lock, and the crowd watched him with curiosity. 2 girls nearby suddenly flushed and screamed in terror. Sei looked away in surprise, not understanding what had happened. One of the passers-by shouted that the object had rolled. Sei stood frozen, holding a suitcase, while the people around him laughed and whispered, staring at his bewildered expression. On the ground lay a few books and a strange, elongated object. His gaze fell on it, sweat beading on his face and true terror in his eyes. Sei stood frozen, sweat streaming down his face as he clutched Runamilia's wooden suitcase. Beside him lay a strange, unidentified object. What fell to the ground looked blatantly indecent. He was gasping, drenched in sweat and panicked, unsure what to do next. An indecent object tumbled out of Runamilia's suitcase, causing Sei's hands to shake. He breathed heavily and stared at it. Scarlet stood behind the girls, who were already screaming with embarrassment. The sight of the object made her go bright red and cry out even louder. Drops of sweat ran down his face as he turned sharply toward Scarlet's scream, and his expression was both frightened and focused. Sei gripped his suitcase and scanned the room nervously for an exit. His gaze landed on Zofie, only 16, with adults standing behind her. Zofie's face flushed as she eyed the object's length and compared it to herself, sweat covering it and her expression showing surprise. Surprised, she looked down, then at Sei, who stood sweating and holding a suitcase. A gust of wind lifted Zofie's cloak, and she looked at his thighs. Everything around her froze in oppressive silence. Zofie's jacket slid off her shoulder. Her hand propped her chin, her eyes utterly empty. Standing with her hand on her chin, Zofie ran complex calculations in her head. A dark ribbon with a pendant hung around her neck. Sei did not take his eyes off her face, but something distracted him. Runamilia stood apart from the others, a scarf on her head as the wind played with her hair. She raised her hand and stood still, staring straight ahead. Sei stood with his suitcase and turned his gaze to her. Runamilia watched him in silence. He looked down at the floor, sweat running down his face, and the moment the thief snatched the suitcase came back with Runamilia's expression vivid in his mind. She went bright red, cried, and shouted that it was her suitcase. Taking in her reaction and putting the pieces together, Sei's face began to change. Gradually his features relaxed. He closed his eyes and a gentle smile appeared on his lips. Fully relaxed, he began setting the suitcase down, and his face settled into a calm expression as he turned to Runamilia. Startled, she covered her face with her hands and began to cry, choking on sobs. Sei's face tightened. He frowned and looked worried for her. Runamilia began to shake with fear, breathing in short gasps as her legs buckled from the tension. Sei stared at her with his mouth open, sweat dripping down his face. Closing his mouth, he took on a serious expression. His face slowly changed. A smile appeared on his lips, and he barely stifled a laugh. Everyone nearby froze, and when his laugh rang out, terror swept over them, and drops of sweat ran down their frightened faces. Holding a suitcase in one hand, he picked up an indecent object from the floor and nervously said he was glad to carry out the order. People flinched and held out their hands. A mad grin twisted his face, and he said that if the item was stolen, he would lose a client. He held both the object and Runamilia's suitcase, his face full of horror and his mouth wide open. In a loud, strained voice, He said the item was very expensive. Scarlet stood beside him, flushed, with her hand to her face, and another girl nearby went pale. Zofie stood on the other side of the crowd, her eyes nearly bulging out of their sockets. Behind her were a few men and a girl in a headscarf, all shocked. Say, holding his suitcase and the object, asked the coachman whether he was all right and unhurt. The coachman turned away and said he was fine. Say's face twisted into a crazed expression, and he shouted that he could heal the coachman with magic and instantly stop his pain, but the coachman frantically refused. The coachman had a bump on his head. A man stepped toward him, and the coachman covered his face with his hands and shouted in panic for him not to come closer. 2 horse-drawn wagons slowly rolled along a rocky road through a dense forest toward tall mountains looming ahead like dark giants. Say sat on the bench inside the wagon, legs crossed and hands clasped together. Several men sat beside him, but kept their distance. Wooden chests and sacks with various goods lay inside. A hush settled over the cart, broken only by the clip of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wheels. Saya's face was wary and tense, as if he was thinking about something dangerous. Both wagons followed each other along the road that ran beside the river, with dense trees and a dark forest on one side and mountain ridges rising on the other. One wagon raced along the rocky road, green grass and low shrubs lining both sides, and the steady clop of hooves cut the air and echoed far around. Scarlet sat quietly with her lips moving as if she hesitated, then at last lifted her head, cheeks flushed and brow furrowed, and asked them to stop the cart so she could gather flowers. A dark-haired man in a hat, holding the reins, warned that the area was dangerous and full of monsters, so they should not stray far from the road. But Scarlet, her voice steady, said she had combat skills. The coachman straightened his hat, said it was not bad, then allowed a short rest but warned the girl to deal with the monster right away if it appeared. Both wagons stopped on the stone road, and the travelers stepped out to stretch as a river flowed nearby. A dark forest rose beyond it, and in the distance, snow-covered mountains came into view. Say also stepped onto the stone road, looked into the water, and saw his own reflection swaying with the current. He bowed his head and squinted, lost in thought. His hair was slightly tousled, and the hood had slipped onto his shoulder, revealing his face. Say told Scarlet that monsters might be hiding nearby and offered to check the area, but Scarlet hung her head, closed her eyes, and stayed silent, refusing his offer. Say looked at her, and his face suddenly registered surprise, as if he had seen something unexpected. He watched Scarlet walk away and noticed a strong flow of magic around her, realizing she could check the area with spells while holding her magic staff. Lost in thought, Scarlet slowly turned back towards Saya. Her face looked thoughtful, her hair fell in curls, and her lips seemed ready to say something important. Turning around, she said coldly and defiantly that Say should not try to talk to her anymore because he seemed too strange. Say gave a nervous smile, but her words angered him, and he watched her with anger in his eyes. Say's expression shifted as he sensed someone nearby and turned his gaze away from Scarlet. Zofie stood beside him, her jacket slipping off her shoulders and her hair tied back in a ponytail, watching Say with a steady expression as he looked at her in surprise, hands in his pockets. His gaze fell on Zofie, who had hidden her hands behind her back and blushed, but she kept watching him closely. And tall grass grew thick along the road, Say said, surprised, asking if she needed anything from him. In the background, the forests and tall mountains grew darker. Zofie blushed more, put her hand to her lips and fell into thought. Her hands went up, shame flushing her face as she started asking senseless questions. Say smiled nervously, closed his eyes, and said she had probably misunderstood him. They both looked toward the river and the surrounding woods. Then Say broke the silence and said the item they had been talking about had indeed been ordered. Zofie replied that Say should not pretend, because she knows a man who also likes such things. Say kept staring into the distance and quietly said that, above all, he was interested in women. Zofie cut him off and told him to choose one and not stand so close to her. She then stepped aside. A piercing scream sounded nearby, and Say tensed, his face changing as he turned toward it while Zofie also looked there, surprised. Say sprang up and ran toward the shout. Zofie stood still while Say pushed through trees and bushes with a weapon in his hand and noted that monsters often gather near bodies of water. Cutting through thick undergrowth, He swept branches aside with his sword, his face serious and his mind alert, since the silence could mean not just predators but real monsters. Running through the thicket, he suddenly saw a tree broken in two and lying on the ground. It made him uneasy and he became more cautious. Bursting into the clearing, Sei stopped short and dropped to one knee. Wind whipped his hair and cloak, and a cloud of dust rose from his landing. His eyes lit up and he looked around sharply. A huge monster appeared before him, its jaws wide open, sharp teeth jutting out, and thick saliva dripping with steam. Sei dropped into a fighting stance, clutching his weapon as a giant monster with huge claws loomed above, its body made of segments like a centipede's armor. Sei stood before the massive monster and activated his appraisal ability. Its stats appeared as a red-cheeked giant at level 25. Sei calmly looked up at the beast, keeping his cool as the wind tossed his hair and cloak and his body slid sideways into a ready fighting stance. His gaze moved to Scarlet, who was lying on the ground holding her staff, her underwear pulled down and her cheeks flushed with shame. A stream that burst from Scarlet's body soaked into the ground. Behind it lay picturesque forests and mountains, but a monster loomed threateningly close. He spun sharply, lifting one hand and gripping a sharp sword in the other, then leaned forward as a faint smile touched his lips while the wind stirred leaves around him. With his blade raised, he said seriously that he didn't expect to see such beauty here. Scarlet, still sitting on the ground, blushed and tightened her grip on her staff. Hearing his words, the girl blushed even more and, in despair, cried that he had seen everything. Her voice trembled with embarrassment. Sei closed his eyes and smiled contentedly, saying that Scarlet was right, that he really had seen it all in perfect detail. A gigantic monster loomed before the hero. Its jaws opened in a predatory grin, showing it was ready to attack at any moment. The young man watched the monster's movements closely, holding his sword at the ready. He understood the beast would not come closer and that its predator instinct made it stalk its prey. The young man confidently shifted his weapon into a more comfortable grip. The monster was overconfident in its strength and did not rush to attack, treating the fight as easy. Fed up with waiting, the hero decided to act alone. Not caring who started the fight, he took it upon himself and stepped forward. Focused, he said he was using the magical infusion technique. Raising his sword, he aimed the blade at the enemy and prepared to deliver a devastating strike. The monster lunged forward, its mouth packed with fangs, and the boy's blow landed on its armored skull, making the beast emit an angry growl. The beast rose onto its hind legs and loomed over the boy, who looked small and helpless, but the hero refused to back down and held his ground. The sword in his tight grip split against the monster's strong armor, and he watched in horror as he was left without a weapon. The reborn host cursed inwardly but kept a calm face. Staring the beast in the eye, he knew he had to stand firm to find a way to win. A majestic forest spread beneath the mountains. The wind rustled the leaves as if nature itself were breathing, and in the distance a flock of birds rose, startled by something in the thicket. A slight figure of a girl appeared in the thicket, pushing aside thorny branches with her hands, and each step was a struggle. Suddenly a rustling sounded. The girl tensed because anyone could be hiding in those thickets. Then an unknown creature appeared right in front of her. Ignoring her, the monster sped forward after the protagonist who could not pull away. It snapped its fangs as it tried to grab him. The monster kept chasing, let out a fierce roar, and was ready to seize the boy. The hero dropped suddenly to draw the creature away from the girl. Planning to lure the enemy deeper into the woods so he could slip away later, he still hesitated about returning to his comrades to fight together. Lost in thought, he suddenly heard a shout ordering him to step back and let someone else strike. Stunned, the young man looked around because the voice came from nowhere. Meanwhile, the girl hiding among the trunks of the old trees decided to help, drew a knife from under her cloak and rushed into the fight. Holding the blade in her hand, the heroine stepped forward, ready to deliver a crushing blow and save the boy from the danger closing in on him. A brave young woman jumped high and plunged her knife into the monster's armor. The blade scratched the shell and even tore it in places. The beast roared in pain. The wounded beast crashed to the ground with a fierce roar that would make anyone flinch. The girl landed as well, and using her momentum, sliced its shell all the way to the tail. The hero rushed to her, shouting Lola's name and telling her to stop. He warned her dagger was too small to deal a mortal blow to the monster. At that moment, the girl sensed danger and spun around, frightened to see the monster's heavy tail with steel spikes at the tip flying straight at her. The blow hit its mark, and the girl's feather-light body flew far backward. She was frightened, but suffered only a cut on her leg from a spike, and her knife broke. The worst part was that the hit altered her course and sent her straight into the monster's gaping mouth full of sharp teeth. Helpless, she flew, gripped by terror. At the crucial moment, a young man steps in, knocks the girl out of the path with a sharp move, pulls her into his arms, shields her with his body from the monster, and carries her to safety. The hero glances back to see how far they've escaped their pursuers. Leaping from branch to branch, he carries the girl in his arms, throws off their trail, and draws the enemy away. Once he is sure the monster has fallen back, the young man stops to rest, settles onto a branch of a giant tree, and gently frees the frightened girl from his arms. She lands hard with a low groan. The young man helps her sit and asks how she feels after the ordeal, and she says she's all right, though she didn't expect the fight to be so hard or the enemy so strong. The main character looks toward where they came from and notices the monster is no longer chasing them, which both calms and unsettles him. Nearby, heavy breathing can be heard. An exhausted girl is sweating and breathing hard. Pain from the wound on her leg grows worse and makes her tremble. Seeing her condition worsen, the young man takes a scrap of cloth to bind her leg and stop the bleeding, saying it looks like a mild poison left in the wound by the monster's thorn. The caring hero bandages the girl's wound. She thanks him, and he explains that his friend Luna Maria is a nun who has holy magic that can heal her. Under the tree, a girl appears and calls the hero by name. Taking the wounded woman in his arms, he says she arrived just in time and asks Luna Maria to help if she can. Waiting for an answer, the young man drifts into thought. He realizes something was off about the monster from the start, and that it is far more dangerous than it first seemed. He also remembers that the witch he was meant to protect relied too much on her power, and it still puzzles him that no one noticed the giant monster roaming the forest. Studying the enemy's abilities, the boy concludes that the many legs along its body let it accelerate instantly. That sharply lowers the victim's chance of survival. Wiping sweat from his brow, he holds the wounded girl tightly in his arms and keeps thinking. A terrible thought hits him. If such a creature wanted to sneak up unnoticed, it could attack from beneath the ground. The thought freezes the hero with fear. At that moment, a monster bursts up from beneath the ground, trying to swallow the heroes. The sudden shock lifts the earth and the beast's mouth snaps at the air. The young man pushes himself up with all his strength to avoid the deadly jaws, straining to keep his balance. He saves himself and the girl from instant death. Rising to its full length, the monster towers over the forest, closing on the fleeing figure. One of the bony blades it used to rip the earth snaps with a sharp sound. Steam vents from its body and lightning sparks race along its shell. Still holding the girl, the young man is thrown back and irritably admits that the monster almost reached them with its blades and appeared far too suddenly. A nun who stumbled onto the scene watches in horror, cries out his name and pleads that he be all right after such an attack. Turning toward his friend's voice, the hero sees something awful. A monster is sneaking up behind her, and he shouts to Luna Maria to turn around immediately. A cold shiver runs down her spine, freezing her body as she realizes in horror that the monster is racing straight at her, having chosen a defenseless target. The hero lands swiftly and places his companion in a safe spot among the roots of a sprawling tree, and only after making sure she is safe, he turns back to Luna Maria and yells for her to run. The girl's expression changes suddenly. She meets his gaze with playful eyes, proud and confident, and silently shows she has no intention of running. She draws a heavy, club-like weapon, takes a fighting stance, and loudly declares to the approaching monster that she is ready to take all its attacks. Her weapon starts to glow in her hands, lighting the area as she holds the staff in front of her, ready to face the enemy. Luna Maria watches the enemy's movements closely, reading his intent. Her weapon stays ready to parry the first strike instantly. In a burst of resolve, the nun rushes forward, shouting that she will not let the monster touch Sayasamu, and her weapon begins to throw off sparks of lightning that threaten the enemy. From a safe distance, the girl winds up with all her strength and strikes. Her blow is so powerful, it throws the monster's head back like a sudden lightning blast. The young man springs to his feet and rushes toward the nun, determined and ready at a moment's notice to leap in and help his friend fight the monster. His gaze is focused and his face shows steady confidence. Moving with startling speed and agility, he kicks up clouds of dust and, concentrating all his power in his feet, rockets up the monster's body to reach its head and land a devastating blow. Right beside the monster's head, he springs up to attack, appearing so suddenly the creature does not notice him at first and did not expect the hero so close. Mid-air, the daredevil starts assembling his weapon. Every move must be lightning quick, or the chance to attack will be lost. The final piece snaps into place with a sharp click, completing the assembly. Having finished his preparations, the young man charges. With a mighty swing of his homemade axe, he severs one of the two blade-like plates on the monster's head. The forest trembles with the beast's terrible roar. Wheezing and making murderous sounds, the monster loses its bearings, its jaws gaping as its limp body falls and slams into the ground with a thunderous crash. The hero pushes off the monster's falling body, solemnly tosses his axe into the air, and tells Lunamiria in a loud voice that he considers the strike brilliant because the result exceeded expectations. The young man's steady gaze falls on the weapon in his female friend's hands, noticing its striking color and texture and suspecting it was made from a rare material called red iron. The young man explains that although red iron is softer than ordinary iron, it conducts magic much better. So when the nun channels her power through it, its strength and durability increase many times, and he had no idea it was that strong. He thinks it is unbelievable that a creature able to break through solid earth was taken down by a stick, which only further highlights Lunamiria's power. The young man looks at his friend with a fire in his eyes and warns that the best part is about to start. Smiling lightly, he apologizes in advance because he's about to show off. The monster's massive body thumps to the ground, rolls and throws up clouds of dust. The motion throws Lunamiria aside and she slams hard into a tree trunk, gasping from the sudden landing. Groaning from back pain, the nun sees the monster, still alive, looming over her and preparing another attack. Its low growl and predatory gleam in its eyes chill her. She realizes in horror that she's trapped and, in desperate disbelief, cries, "No," unable to accept that the monster is still alive after all its wounds. Lunamiria frantically searches for a weapon to defend herself somehow, but the stick is out of reach. Hovering above her, the monster stares down with a menacing look. Its jaws stretch into a hungry grin, ready to swallow the girl at any moment. In a moment, he is already close. A huge maw gapes, ready for a deadly bite. Lunamiria steps back and cries in despair, begging him not to do this. Deeply religious, she closes her eyes and begins to pray, begging the Lord for salvation. Memories of her whole life rise up and her heart accepts the inevitable end. At that moment, the hero appears in the air between her and the monster, and as if a prayer had been answered, he shields his friend with his body, ready to sacrifice himself to save her. The girl's eyes fill with joy and awe. Already prepared to accept death, she now sees her rescuer standing before her like a wall. She calls his name, Sayasama. The young man tenses, frowns, and focuses all his strength and attention on the coming decisive strike. Taking a fighting stance, he applies the technique he learned as a field forms around him and an energetic vortex begins to spin. At that moment, the monster's severed blade, as if summoned by magic, falls beside him. The ground thuds under the weight of the metal. A clever youth grabs the blade's sharp edge, aims, and prepares to deliver the decisive blow to end the enemy who has done them so much harm. Once the monster was in range, the hero threw the blade hard, and it spun like a shuriken through the air and crashed into the beast with a bone-crunching impact. The blade does not stop, slicing diagonally through the monster's body and splitting it in two. The young man stays in a fighting stance, watching the outcome of the attack closely, his eyes alight with curiosity and cold resolve. Staring without looking away at the fallen enemy torn to pieces, he wears a serious, stern face filled with courage. Lunamiria, filled with awe and gratitude, looks at him, knowing he risked his life to save her from mortal danger. Addressing Sayasami, who calmly surveys his neatly finished work, she says she feels he is the chosen one, and lets her gaze travel to the quiet forest stretching behind him. As a child, Lunamiria loved the book, The Pilgrim Path of the Holy Maiden. At every spare moment, she picked it up and reread it as if looking for a hidden meaning. The tale follows a young saint who traveled across worlds, healing the poor and punishing sinners. Trials lined her path, but her mission always shone with the light of truth. Luna Maria remembered how the saint had faced danger many times, but someone always came to help. He became her shield, saving her from suffering and guiding her onward. At the end of the book, it was revealed that the young man was an apostle of God, sent by the Lord himself to guide the holy path of truth as it moved among people seeking those who needed healing. The heroes she so often met on book pages lived in her heart too. Now Say reminded her of that very heavenly apostle, as if sent from above to support and protect her. The hero stood victorious before the monster's body, sliced in two. Pride swelled in his chest at defeating such a dangerous foe. Steam rose from the bloody remains, cloaking everything in a white mist. She could not take her eyes off him. Turning, the young man smiled slyly and asked if she was all right. His charm felt even brighter because he had just saved her life. Her cheeks flushed with a deep blush as she looked at her rescuer with confusion and tenderness. Finding no words and only softly, dreamily whispering his name, a monster split in two hovered over them, still terrifying even in that state. Its shadowy outlines kept them afraid, showing the threat had not yet fully passed. Luna Maria trembled with fear as she stared at the monster's outline, feeling it might still be alive, and in desperation she shouted to Say, asking whether the monster was truly defeated since its body had not yet fallen to the ground. Both heroes stared at the giant insect's carcass as steam rose from its insides and unsettling noises came from within, and they felt the hush before a storm. Suddenly, everything exploded, and a blinding flash lit the heroes' figures. The blast sent a mushroom-shaped cloud into the sky, and the roar scared the birds, which flew shrieking out of the forest. A girl suddenly appeared behind the stunned heroes and laughed sharply as she watched the young men's reactions, clearly enjoying their fear. Her cheeks flushed, and spiteful delight warmed her voice as she turned to the monster and mockingly asked how the terrible insect felt now that it had been defeated. Say, and Luna Maria turned toward the girl, who kept laughing as her laugh grew louder and harsher, their surprised eyes meeting her sneer while their tired faces showed only confusion. A wagon drawn by 2 horses moved through the forest while a warrior stood with his foot on the dead monster lying in the clearing. The beast was defeated and showed no sign of life. The hero who had stepped on it celebrated with his comrades, marking their victory over the monsters they had met on the road. His friend cheered wildly, showing his joy with his whole body. Luna Maria performed a healing miracle. Her magic, known far and wide, healed the wounds of the injured, and people watched with hope as the light of her power gave them life. Lolia stood nearby, a friend of the main character he had rescued along with the nun. She watched the healing with fascination. The nun assured that everything would be fine, and Lolia, feeling relieved, said it was incredible. Lolia returned to Luna Maria and thanked her warmly for her mercy, while Luna Maria smiled and said softly that no thanks were needed because all the credit belongs to Seiyu. Lolia opened her eyes in surprise when she heard the young man's name was Seisama, and because she had not known her rescuer's name, the news only made her more curious and admiring of him. While the men were still celebrating their victory, an unfamiliar woman approached and said in a serious voice that one of the creatures was the larva of a giant red-headed centipede found in these parts. The woman explained that such creatures are poisonous and extremely dangerous. The place may have been rarely sprinkled with holy water because it was far from the city. Fortunately, most of those present were experienced adventurers. One companion noted that if it had been an adult monster, they could have made a fortune selling its remains. But another replied that they had already spent all their strength in the fight and likely would not have survived an adult creature. Standing nearby, Lolia overheard one of the men say that everything would have been different if a true hero had been with them at such a difficult moment. The girl turned slowly and met Luna Maria's distant gaze as she sat on the ground, her eyes clouded by dreams and memories of the young man who that night so resembled the apostle from her favorite book. Meanwhile, the young warrior laid out his tools. Whistling a cheerful tune, he slowly picked through the defeated monster's innards, cutting them out and pulling them free by hand. With a scrap of cloth between his teeth, the young man froze, thinking hard. Carefully, he searched inside the creature for something crucial that could be very valuable to him. From the defeated beast's entrails, he pulled an astonishing, perfectly pure stone, expertly cut. Its glow immediately struck everyone nearby. Carefully cupping the stone, he held it up to the sun, studied the artifact for a few moments, then concluded the magical crystal belonged to the 7th class of all possible. The young man realizes he has found a truly rare stone that could fetch 2 large silver coins if he sells it, and it's also good for making healing medicine. The witch slips up behind him unnoticed and quietly asks if he really saw everything. The young man acts indifferent and says he saw nothing, while inside he hides his nervous excitement. The young woman stares at him and says that even this reaction already speaks for itself and exposes him far more than any words. Trying to look indifferent, the young man fails. He feigns ignorance and asks the witch what she means, saying he was completely focused on the centipede and does not understand where she is leading. Following him step by step, the heroine speaks in a serious voice and tells him to listen closely. She warns that if he so much as lets anything slip, she will roast him the same way she did that monster, and the young man says he does not understand but still will not tell anyone. Luna Maria cuts in and tells the witch this has gone too far. He risked his life fighting the monster. Lolia agrees that without him the battle would have turned out very differently. The witch didn't expect that pressure from her friends, so she hesitates and awkwardly agrees they might be right. But she won't finish the thought because she doubts her own words. The protagonist smiles awkwardly and looks at the young witch, who clicks her tongue in disgust, flushes with hurt, and mumbles something incomprehensible and irritated. Mountains rise in this background, surrounded by dense forest. A slow line of wagons moves along the road, the wheels creaking loudly on the stones. From one carriage, a voice asks permission to introduce itself to the heroes once more. The voice belongs to Luna Maria, who says calmly that she is a nun of the Holy Church and that she is now on a monastic journey, thinking about how to accomplish a feat and overcome the labyrinth in the lotus. Lolia steps forward to introduce herself and admits she belonged to an assassin clan and once worked for a large organization, but after a tragic incident she was removed. So now she wants to become an adventurer in Lotus. The third girl goes by Scarlet, a mage who graduated with honors from the Royal Academy of Magic. Despite many offers, she chose the life of an adventurer because she wants to become a true witch. The line reaches the protagonist, who introduces himself as Say, a simple carrier of goods, then gives a sly smile and jokingly says he is on the same team as Luna Maria herself. The transformed item carrier admits he plans to become an adventurer in Lotus. Lolia says it's their shared dream. Scarlet notices the carriage is taking them straight to Lotus. The nun says with enthusiasm that all of this is clearly God's will, and believes no event in this world happens without God's knowledge. Returning to the companions, she suggests that since they are already friends and comrades, they form their own group of adventurers led by the main hero, and the sorceress, taken aback, angrily shouts that it will never happen. Lolia, however, enthusiastically supports the idea, saying she is ready to join without hesitation because the hero saved her life fighting a monster and she owes him, and he has proven himself a capable young man. The witch looks at her and says she is too naive, warning that Lolia makes that choice only because she has not yet seen real adventurers, since the Lotus is full of people like him. She adds that if a rumor got out that she was on the same team as the young man, her reputation would be tarnished. The young man agrees, admitting it would be embarrassing if anyone found out about that incident. The girl the hero had been teasing suddenly jumps to her feet and waves her arms angrily, shouting at the young man and accusing him of revealing her secret and now blackmailing her with it, as the carriage continues rolling toward the mountains. When the heroes arrive in the city, night has already fallen on the outskirts, so the adventurers stop by a hotel, decide to spend the night in cozy cottages, and head to Lotos in the morning. One of the girls brightens with delight when she sees their future homes. The main character proudly says he booked 2 cottages with gardens. The nun, who rarely stayed in such luxury, is genuinely pleased. The young man explains that when he searched for a hotel, only these 2 places were available. A night there was expensive, so he wanted to be sure his companion was happy. She replied that it was no problem. Suddenly, the hero remembers something important. sighs deeply, takes out a new suitcase and hands it to the nun. A surprised girl accepts the unexpected gift while the boy explains he bought a suitcase to replace the one that broke in today's rush, saying he knows how important it is to her and asking her to use this one. Luna Miria blushes, softly says the hero's name and thanks him for the precious gift, grateful for all he has done, and already beginning to see him as her protector, even comparing him to the apostle from her favorite book. The young man gives an awkward smile and says he does not understand what she means, believing team members should look out for one another and cover each other's backs when needed, and he is sure anyone would do the same. The hero says they have a nice hotel and tells the girl to rest in her room and regain her strength for the next day. The nun gratefully agrees, pleased by his care. The young man waves and walks away, leaving the girl standing on the cottage porch. She watches him go for a long time, full of gratitude and mild embarrassment. Stepping back, the hero breathes a sigh of relief and tells himself he can now pretend the strange device never existed. Walking to his room, he goes over everything he heard and, though he has no proof, remains convinced the girl had a reason to use that item, so he decides to trust her. The young man lifts his eyes to the moon above the mountains and tells himself firmly he will carry out his plan, while the girl, holding a suitcase, stands awkwardly on the porch after his gift. The scene shifts to a garden bathed in moonlight. In a far corner, a large tub for bathing guests stands, and nearby, a copper cauldron heats water over the fire. Singing fills the air, reflecting the hero's joyful mood. Lifting the cauldron off the fire, the young man pours hot water into the tub to mix with the cold water, then drops flower petals into the water to set a romantic mood as he prepares to carry out his plan. Carefully stepping into the tub, he feels the warm water wrap around his body beneath the night sky. Relieved, he slips his legs out and rests them on the rim, enjoying the long-awaited rest. With delight, the hero says the open bath under the starry sky is the best invention, his voice confident, and he decides to occasionally fully enjoy the garden's beauty. The young man sighs with relief again, enjoying the moment, when something suddenly occurs to him and he says he nearly forgot one important thing. He notes with displeasure that the nearby drink is nothing like Japanese juice, but a moment later, he forgets it and lets himself enjoy the pleasant moment, exhaling loudly after a sip. The young man looks up at the moon and thinks a pure-hearted nun has probably never bathed outdoors, so he considers taking the chance to invite her to his place. He quickly shakes off the thought and tells himself it is just a joke. The girl would never dare get into the same bath with a man, so he firmly decides not to invite her to avoid trouble. Thoughts overwhelm him again, and he begins to think his dream may not be so out of reach, since the circumstances and a recent discovery suggest things could turn out differently. Imagination paints a picture. He leans over a puzzled girl, showers her with compliments, and calls her enchanting. In his dreams, he begs to be shown more of her gentle beauty. The young man imagines how the girl will react. He expects her to look away, shyly cover herself, and with a trembling voice begs Sasamu not to look at her innocence. Then he addresses her silently, reminding her they are friends, and telling her she has nothing to be ashamed of and can relax around him. But the girl objects, insisting she is a servant of God. The young man gently calls her by name, Luna Miria. In a quiet, slow, seductive voice, he says it doesn't matter to him at all. A passionate young man looks straight into her eyes and says she is indispensable to him, something she can see for herself, and he adds that he has opened up completely and is now ready to give himself to her. He gazes into her wide, trusting eyes and convinces her to trust him, telling her to open up and let the more experienced person take over. A girl slightly parts her hot lips and says his name in a spellbound, helpless tone. The nun's shyness fades as she leans forward toward the hero's heated body, saying she is glad for his trust and admitting she didn't even know how much he valued her. Revealing herself completely, she softly says his name and, deeply moved, asks him to explore every inch of her body so he will carry it in his memory forever. The young man rises from the water, rubbing his numb back, and lifts his eyes to the night sky as he tries to sort his thoughts tangled by passionate fantasies. The protagonist lifts the drink to his lips. His heart races because his imagination has made him too excited to stay calm. Taking a sip, he runs a hand through his hair and drifts into thought, then decides not to miss the chance, and tries his luck by saying aloud, he will invite the object of his fantasies to join him in the bath. The young man leaps out of the barrel and tells himself he will not think any bad thoughts. He decides only to help the girl regain her strength and runs through the garden, repeating that he is just looking for a friend. On his way to the girl's cottage, the protagonist grabs a towel and ties it around his waist so he does not frighten the nun at the door, and he tries to calm his pounding heart. Finally, he reaches the door and prepares to knock, calling Munimiria's name loudly to announce his arrival, when a soft moan and her voice freeze him in surprise. He told himself it had been too close. Quietly, the young man moved to the door to listen, unsure if the heroine was really talking to someone in her room. Still and listening, he hears the rustle fade, concludes the girl is talking to herself, and wonders whether she talks in her sleep. Again, he hears fragments of speech. A nun calls his name anxiously. Her breath grows heavy, and her tender voice confesses love to him. Frozen by the door, the main character stands stunned by what he heard. He expected to hear anything but this confession, which sends his heart racing. The girl remains dazed, languidly whispering his name and confessing her love, pressing her legs together as she says, the hero is strong and brave because he protected her from a predatory beast. In her sleep, the heroine admits the young man is her ideal, tosses and turns, hugging a pillow as if it were him, and keeps saying she loves him. Hearing the confession, he leans against the cottage wall, stunned by her words. She keeps moaning, calling him her apostle, and it sounds so sincere that his heart clenches. The young man pauses, realizing he heard something he was not meant to hear, and decides everything is clear now because he had felt special trust and tenderness from her since their first meeting. He remembers the Bible stories about the saint's pilgrimage the young nun often reread. In them, an apostle of God defends the saint, and he realizes she sees him as that apostle. He smiles bitterly. A title like Apostle of God cannot be his. Remembering Munimiria, the boy realizes this world is too harsh for her. Sadly, he thinks that everything he tried to protect until the end was always mercilessly taken from him by the world, and it stayed that way his whole life. The boy feels his very existence proves that God is against him. Every loss and every pain reminds him of it, again and again. With a heavy heart, the hero decides a laborer like him can never meet the hopes of the pure, beautiful Lunamiria, and the gulf between them only widens each day. Turning away sadly, he is about to leave but imagines himself as a great traveler in the future, and decides that to win the girl's heart, he must become someone who can protect what is most precious. He decides that until he masters it, he should pretend he heard nothing, when suddenly her moan rises again from the cottage, and calling his name, she talks excitedly about the device. The young man shudders in horror when he hears the woman cry out as if asking him to come in. Her sighs and cries grow louder, and the nun calls for greater intensity to reach full satisfaction. Panicking, the young man runs along the porch, embarrassed that she is so openly giving in to passion, and because she keeps shouting his name, he would give anything to make her stop. Finally, he finds a crack in the window frame and decides to peek in. Through the gap, a girl inside waves her arms helplessly. The boy's eyes widen. He did not expect to see the girl in such a revealing, embarrassing pose that stirs him. The heroine sobs loudly and declares her love for him, rolling on the bed and dreaming that Sasama loves her back, touching herself and imagining having his child. The girl's words hit him like thunder, and although he knows a nun cannot return to secular life, he still cannot stop the strange tremor he feels when he looks at her. Right then, when she says again that she loves him, something inevitable begins to rise under his towel, revealing the strength of his desire. The nun leans back, weeping, and asks his forgiveness, admitting that in such moments she always imagines him and chastises herself as a saint turned into a sinner. A young woman speaks aloud about how she imagines their union, describing its depth and fierce desire, calling herself bad while demanding the young man give himself to her and father a child. She arches as if he is really there and touches her own body, imagining his touch. A string of short cries ends with one desperate, passionate sound that comes from deep inside her. Watching through the crack without looking away, the hero follows every moment as the girl nears the peak of her pleasure, her body arching in a final surge. An object that had been helping her slips from her hands and clatters to the floor. The boy immediately recognizes the same device he once found. The exhausted nun collapses onto the bed. An object falls to the floor with a dull thud. Her body remains bare, now wrapped in a warm wave of relaxation. Puzzled, the hero keeps looking through the crack, her gaze foggy, her breathing slowly steadying, and she reveals a side he has never seen before. Lunamiria sets the device she just used in front of her. With her hands folded, she looks ready to begin the evening prayer. Suddenly she speaks the words of cleansing, loud and confident. A winged being with a halo appears before her. The heavenly girl picks up the object and begins to clean off the remaining debris. The protagonist watches in stunned silence, struck that even in this situation the nun keeps praying, as if seeking protection from the heavens. The winged girl continues cleaning the device, lowering her eyes with such humility and majesty that it feels like a sacred ritual, as a soft, magical glow begins to spill from the cottage. Meanwhile, the scene moves into the narrow lanes of the city at night, and Lolia walks slowly between dark buildings, greedily finishing a fragrant piece of bread, when something far off slowly approaches and draws her attention. The main character approaches the girl. A killer from the shadows asks him whether he really is what she thinks. She admits she went out tonight to enjoy the darkness. Her gaze drops, and she says with surprise that the hero is hard as a rock, noting it shows even through his pants. The young man nods awkwardly and tries to avoid further conversation. He tells his friend that too many things happened that day. A short circuit seems to be happening in his head. He feels that any more and his mind will burst from emotional overload. A young man bluntly says he should go to a brothel to ease some tension and freshen up. The girl glances at his pants and, smiling, asks if his brain is throbbing in them. The young man brushes past the woman he was talking to without caring and says he's done if she agrees, then starts to walk away, and the girl, surprised by his coldness, calls for him to stop. She warns him that because this is his first visit, he should know one important thing he missed. The hero, curious, asks what she means. The girl explains there are no brothels here. He turns to her in horror, unsure how to deal with the problem that keeps him from thinking calmly. Stunned, he cries out and asks her again if it is really true that there is not a single brothel in this town. She says the town is small and she's already checked everything. As the closest settlement to Lotos, there just doesn't seem to be any demand for this. The girl says their squad will reach Lotos tomorrow and tells him to hold on a little, but the hero knows that after what he saw in the cottage he can no longer calm his restlessness. Irritated, the boy says that at this pace he'll be overcome tomorrow on the road by a fierce urge to grab someone in the wagon, and he knows this would be the worst possible outcome for the trip ahead. Smiling slyly, the young woman reaches into his pants and when she touches him, is surprised by his impressive size. She adds boldly that he is about to explode. The boy jumps back and yells for her to stop touching him with her hands. She grows serious and says the hero saved her today when the monster almost killed her. So as a sign of gratitude, she decides to help him in her own way. Scene shifts to a dark alley between buildings where people walk by calmly, unaware of what is happening in the dark corner. The woman works steadily, occasionally looking up at the man to catch her breath, then bending back toward his clothing. The young man breathes in short, ragged gasps. With every move she makes, his breathing grows faster and hotter. Gently stroking her hair, he moans softly and, unable to hold back, tells his partner how incredibly good he feels now. Not answering him with words, the girl presses on with renewed energy, driving the man to the edge and making him barely hold back a cry of pleasure. The man looks down at the woman and firmly guides her head with his palm, enjoying the feeling of being dominant in the situation. A young man hears voices from the busy street and sees their shadows flicker just around the corner, very close, so he tenses every muscle, holding back any sound that might draw attention. She pulls away from him for a moment to rest, wipes the residue from her chin, and leans back toward his fly, this time changing her technique. At last, she finishes the task, steps aside, and rises to her feet. Smiling, she thanks the boy for letting her have a sort of treat. Admiringly, she says his size is impressive, and the amount of fluid never stops surprising her. He admits she surprised him too and praises her skill. The reborn native asks how often the girl does things like that for men. The girl tells him not to take it literally, saying she only repaid a debt and does not plan to give such gifts to everyone. The heroine reveals the truth. The former director of the company where she worked had strange tastes. For rewards, she provided such services to him and learned various techniques. The young man, sadness in his voice, says everything is clear now. He realizes the boss used his position and money to indulge his own whims at her expense. The hero accepts this as normal in the other world and sees its cruelty again. Survival of the fittest rules here, and society is built on inequality. A guy stops a girl who is about to leave, offers a deal, and asks for her opinion. Noticing Lolia has no healing potions with her, he asks if that is true. She answers she has never had a serious wound or poisoning and has enough money. That was exactly what the hero had counted on. He looks her in the eye and says that potions are essential for an adventurer because having them often decides whether you live or die, adding that he has plenty. The guy continues. If the girl wants, he'll even give a few for free, but he asks for physical help in return, then corrects himself and says he'd rather just have a friend to support him when he needs it. After a moment's thought, she agrees, admitting the deal is fair. Lolia thinks the price is too low and insists the hero also pay for her room. The boy agrees without hesitation. Not wanting to waste time, she suggests going straight to her place to finish things and says it is very close. The hero gladly follows her along the route she shows. They walk through narrow, dark streets and climb the stairs to Lolia's room, and the stairs are quite steep, so the boy looks around with curiosity. In the room, the man can't help watching the young woman as she slowly takes off her jacket, revealing her soft, delicate shoulders. Deciding to follow her example, the young man pulls off his cloak and is left in just a shirt. Using his ability, he makes the clothes disperse into the air. Lolia notes that this is an extremely convenient gift. She looks at his pants and smiles, saying today will be difficult for her. She adds that his size could make even experienced women in brothels cry. The man nods proudly. She continues, saying its width and length match the wooden device she saw earlier that day, asks if it has the same shape, and the protagonist recalls and admits it does. The girl freezes in surprise, remembering how he said the wooden piece was custom-made, so she asks directly who actually commissioned the device, and he falters and looks away. The girl already vividly imagines the hero enjoying himself with other men, and she looks at him in surprise, while he, seeing that in her eyes, quickly explains that it's not what she thinks. The man says he is interested only in women and is completely indifferent to men. She shrugged and said she didn't care, adding that even if he wanted to spice up his nightlife, he couldn't because in this town you can't hire a man. He turns to her to say something, but the words stick in his throat and he freezes as his eyes fall on an unexpected sight. The heroine slowly removes another layer of clothing and lowers her gaze to study her body. In the room's dim light, her figure looks remarkably feminine, and the hero studies every line before their eyes meet. He smiles, expecting a hot night. With a quick move, he pushes her onto the bed. She gasps in surprise and waves her hands, unhappy that he takes charge right away. She stays lying there, waiting for his move, and he understands, starting to pull off his t-shirt while saying he will show her with his body how much he likes chaste girls. She lies still, waiting for him to lean over her and start the fun. The young man lies down on the bed beside her and reminds her that, as he said before, she must pay for the potion with her own body. He leans so low his face almost touches hers. Looking into the girl's daring eyes, the hero says that if he doesn't enjoy the night with her, the deal will be off. With his help, the last of her clothes slips off. Studying her body, he says that if she thinks she can get away without trying, she must be ready to fail. The boy adds that she must now prove she is capable. Hearing this, she breaks into a sly, desire-filled smile. She gently touches his cheek. As the young man lets his guard down, the heroine quickly flips him onto his back. The boy did not expect that. Boldly, she asks what would happen if she drained him completely, then jokes that she would get all his potions if she does even better than he expects. The hero watches her body in silence, pleased to be in the hands of a resourceful woman who can take charge even in this situation. She warns him not to underestimate her abilities and says he must make the decision now, not her. As she takes off the last piece of clothing, she warns that her techniques are so good even the director of her former company begged her to be his passion. The young man notices he hasn't done anything yet while she's already completely ready. And seeing this for the first time, he looks at her with distrust but accepts it as an advantage. The girl leans toward him, showing she is ready to act. The hero reacts in surprise as he realizes her boasting was justified. She really can light up so quickly. Sitting carefully on him, she gasps with pleasure, trying to make the right impression on the hero to get the promised potion. And she succeeds. She begins to move, gradually increasing her speed and rhythm with each motion, and he feels her take him fully and hold him close with her whole body, showing real skill in the art of love. The young man comments on her movements, admitting how much he likes them. The heroine giggles and replies that the hero's giant turned out to be not bad at all. Leaning over him, she warns she won't hold back anymore. Even if he cries, she will keep going. With a glazed look, she calls him brother, and the boy trembles with pleasure. A fierce clash of passion erupts between them, their cries carrying out into the street as the man grips her thighs to keep the rhythm and his ragged breathing grows hotter. She arches her back into a curve, trying to give him more pleasure while also enjoying herself. The room grows stifling and hot, the air feels searing. The young man studies her eagerly, touching her so she sighs. Their lips meet occasionally, both flushed and sweating from their continuous movement. He adjusts his position to support Lola and make her more comfortable. They melt into a hot kiss, and he notices how enchanting this girl is as she completely gives herself to him. He feels warm and content inside her. The young man notices she skillfully uses her rare gift, the art of physical pleasure, and feels happy that the night with her will stay in his memory forever. Mastery of bodily pleasures is a special skill that, through magic, lets you control your body and its most sensitive spots, and even become pregnant or avoid pregnancy. The hero knows that mastering this skill is very difficult, and requires learning to control the body and magical energy, especially restorative magic, so it is extremely rare. At the same time, the young man realizes it's all just theory, and in reality the craft has many subtleties and nuances that cannot be mastered without years of practice. The hero realizes this is not the end. By focusing her magic on the most sensitive spots, the girl can heighten the sensations so their union becomes twice as pleasurable for both. This ability affects the young man especially strongly. Despite his past experience in love, he is going through this for the first time. Lola's knowledge and technique even scare him, and the hero realizes she pins down men's weak spots to influence them, doing it so masterfully it takes his breath away. Her skill gives him sensations that intensify tenfold. The hero can only compare them to heavenly pleasure and cosmic wonder. The young man blames himself for once thinking of her as just a plain wallflower. He was wrong. Girls with skills like hers are very rare. Lola laughs and says he not only has a large size but also knows how to make love at a high level, which flatters the hero and makes him try his hardest to match her. She lifts her face to his and says it is time to teach him a lesson, since otherwise he will not admit she brought him to the peak, and announces she is taking the initiative again. She flips him onto his back again. Such decisiveness surprised the boy. Her point is that guys who attack too forcefully often end up the most vulnerable. The woman says this vulnerability shows up most when the man is underneath her, and she then begins moving actively again while watching his face closely. She slyly points out that he is trying to reach the peak and finish as quickly as possible, so she insists the hero not hold back and release everything he has been holding in, wanting to remember this moment. Lola shouts, demanding he give her a child. The hero relaxes, and she shouts again for him not to stop and to finish. A loud, prolonged scream from the heroine ends it. The man arches and pulls out, feeling incredible relief. The hero's partner breathes heavily in short gasps. Looking at him, she admits that without her skill at giving physical pleasure, she would certainly be pregnant. The woman is struck by how much fluid is on the bed. She blushes and smiles, saying that tomorrow he, like her, will not be able to stand, praising his skill and acknowledging him as her equal. The heroine adds that she has not yet met any men who can match her skills. The exhausted hero leans back on the pillows, spent but satisfied by the passionate woman. A moment later, he tells her not to thank him. His automatic regeneration restores his strength instantly, and he looks energetic again. She is stunned. The girl reacts with surprise and cannot believe that after a short rest, the hero is ready again. He eagerly approaches and invites her for a second round of romantic fun. She waves her hands, begging for at least a break. The guy asks where she's headed. Smiling, he says she's badly mistaken if she thinks she can take his whole potion collection in one night. so they should keep playing. The moon that lit the small town all night is replaced at dawn by the bright disk of the sun, pouring dazzling light over the rooftops. The road the heroes follow winds through forests and mountains. On the horizon, a majestic fortress city appears. As they approach, the travelers see giant gates with a heavy iron grill. After a sleepless night, Lola can barely stand and slows the group, while the protagonist looks bright and fully rested. Relieved, the boy says they have finally reached the city of Lotus. Scarlet the sorceress notes in astonishment that the city teems with adventurers like them. Lolu is annoyed by his lofty tone and sarcastically says he talks about it too calmly, muttering that the hero is only a vessel. The boy sighs and replies that it's not what she thinks. It's strange to him that the girls choose to stay with him. He hands Loli the potion and reminds her they worked together yesterday. Taking the vials with a smile, the heroine says he only saw part of her powers yesterday, then narrows her eyes like a predator and tells him to stay alert. Meanwhile, Scarlet scans the crowd, spotting many tough-looking adventurers and realizing that such a concentration of strength could work to their advantage. Surveying everyone, she thinks this is the real Dungeon City, and realizes that if she proves herself and wins with a strong team, she can stay there forever. She watches the hero and Lola, surprised at how quickly passion grew between them, and tries to figure out whether it came from their shared fight with the monster or from something else. She turns to Lunamiria and asks what's happening to their companions. The nun says nothing and watches sadly as her beloved Saiv walks away arm in arm with another girl. Scarlet understands everything without a word, looking at the hero with contempt and unable to see how anyone could be such a playboy, while the young man mumbles that adventurers are crowding the registration window. Returning to his companions, he suggests they eat first, smiles at Lunamiria, and asks her opinion, and the nun gladly agrees to this wonderful idea. The squad heads to the nearest eatery. Each of them came to the Lotus to take the exam to advance in rank, since it's the only quick way to rise in the Adventurers Association. Ranks go from iron to bronze, silver and gold. Higher ranks bring greater political influence. A person with gold status is treated like an aristocrat. Progress depends on how it benefits the association. So adventurers delve into dungeons to defeat major bosses or take urgent quests to earn achievements. Even a seasoned traveler usually needs years to move up in rank, and no one is surprised. Lotus, in Lincoln's lands, is known as the city of bronze rank dungeons. Rules are strict, and every adventurer must follow them. To earn the bronze rank, you must first defeat the powerful magical creatures that inhabit these lands, but newcomers often take on more than they can handle. Every hero who arrives at Lotus is a newcomer. The main character, like his friends, is sure he will earn bronze rank and live freely in this harsh world. Heading out to take the rank-up exam, they must first register with the guild as new adventurers. An attractive receptionist with hair falling over her face meets them at the desk, smiles slyly, and looks at the hero with envy, surprised that at his age he already brought his own team. Ignoring her barbs, the young man asks to register Runo, Amelia, and Zophie as adventurers, pointing to two acquaintances inspecting the guild building while Mao stands nearby, stunned. Registration is not his only goal. The guy also wants to learn important information and is ready to pay for it. He deliberately jingles a coin, showing the woman at the registration desk his wallet. He needs to learn where herbs grow and where monsters live, both in the city and in the labyrinth. The registrar, giving him an appraising look, notes he must have deep pockets, since he's willing to pay generously for such obvious information. Smiling, she says all basic information is free. The archive's data on the labyrinth costs only a silver coin, but since the boy cannot read, he will have to pay twice as much. She has another offer. For a fee, she will reveal things not found in books. Helping without benefit is not worth it, because it could get her reprimanded or even fired. Sai becomes interested and asks what she can offer. The girl explains she has information on the bosses and labyrinth masters' weak points. Her offer is valuable because everyone else relies only on archives. The young man asked who exactly the masters of the labyrinth were, and the receptionist quickly realized he knew nothing. She suggested registering his two companions first, and then going to a secret place where she would explain everything. The nun and the hired killer fill out the required forms, and under the watchful eye of Scarlet and the Observer, they enter every detail. They only need to submit the documents and go through the next procedure. and then they can proudly bear the title of adventurer. The guild registrar leads the boy down narrow corridors and through a few inner courtyards, and finally they enter a small room where a table with a map stands in the center and the walls are lined with bookshelves. The girl explains this archive is reserved for the guild's adventurers. Ordinary people are not allowed in, and not every guild member gets access. According to her, the map on the table shows where the monsters live. You cannot take it with you. You can only use it inside the archive. It helps you learn more and gives you a knowledge advantage. The registrar explains the Lotus Labyrinth is single story, but so vast that even the guild does not know its true size. Investigations have been conducted, but even an approximate scale remains unknown. Despite the lack of sun underground, the sky there shines just like on the surface. It gets dark there at the same time as the sunset outside, giving time to prepare for night. The only difference is the many monsters and the very harsh conditions for survival. Curious how dangerous it would be to stay there, the young man watches as the girl points to circles on the map, the safe zones where adventurers for hundreds of years sprinkled holy water to repel monsters. Sai notices the map is divided into 6 parts. The registrar confirms his guess and says the old scroll shows the territories of the 5 bosses and the labyrinth master himself. As the young man flips through books and scrolls, the young woman explains that the Lotus Bronze Rank exam has 2 stages. The first is a practical test, a fight with a guild examiner to prove one's skill. The second stage is a team trial. Gather a group and defeat the labyrinth master. First, defeat the bosses in each region. Flipping through old documents, a young man finds most are ordinary, but one entry draws his attention, and when he studies it, he opens his eyes wide in surprise. Documents show bosses at levels 26 to 31, and the labyrinth master at level 38, and the hero thinks they are too strong for the bronze exam. She had not mentioned this before, but when she hears the boy's conclusion, she crosses her arms over her chest and narrows her eyes because he noticed the most important thing. According to her, the death rate in the Lotus Labyrinth is very high, especially in recent months. Besides bosses, other strong monsters and even whole packs have been appearing there. Many people run out of strength before they reach their goal. The registrar says the heroes will need huge luck to avoid being exhausted before the boss fights, but they cannot rely on fortune alone and need skills and long training. She explains that if the team manages to defeat the main monster, it won't respawn for about 10 days, and you can follow updates on the guild's notice board. Reading the documents, the young man realizes that in recent months no one has managed to defeat the bosses or the master. Some were killed, others surrendered, and some were simply too scared to go on. The reason is clear. The more deaths in the labyrinth, the stronger the monsters become. They gain strength from adventurers' blood, and the cycle will not break as long as victims keep falling. The mass deaths are due to several factors, including unexpected mutations in the maze, newcomers who underestimated the danger, and chaos caused by false information. A girl's voice pulls him out of his thoughts. She tells him to leave and go to another city where it's easier to raise his rank, though it will take longer. He refuses because he is too curious about everything he heard. Looking at the bulletin board, the young man, newly determined, keeps saying he will earn the bronze rank at any cost. A high difficulty level will not stop him. The girl says nothing, only smiles mysteriously and stops trying to convince him, and after checking the materials again and finding nothing new for himself or the team, the young man prepares to return to his girls. After a while, he returns to the guild hall and looks down from the stairs at the crowd, with some waiting for friends and others hurrying about their business, and he notices some familiar girls nearby. Runa Milia and Zophie proudly show the wooden adventurer tokens hanging on their chests like pendants, while a nun watches them admiringly, pleased they are now official members of the guild. Applauding, the young man congratulates his friends on the achievement, now recognized as true adventurers, while Scarlet, standing behind them, does not share the excitement and watches more reservedly. Moving closer, the young witch listens to talk about registering the team now that everyone has gathered and become official newcomers, and the nun is genuinely pleased by the news. Scarlet asks if anyone has ideas for a name for the new group, and the younger one's eyes light up immediately as if they've waited their whole lives, ready to offer suggestion after suggestion. Just as the killer begins to speak, the nun interrupts and suggests naming the team Servants of God. Sophie scornfully dismisses the idea as foolish, and Scarlet looks reproachful, while the boy simply sighs, calling them typical rookies. Runamilia asks the witch for her opinion because the name Servants of God sounds odd. Zophia's suggestion, the girls, doesn't work either since there is a boy on the team, and Scarlet rolls her eyes and says she doesn't care. The girls don't back down and hug the witch, pleading for advice again. Scarlet turns to the boy and asks him as their leader, and he replies without hesitation with the simple name Carriers. The girls are outraged, saying it's worse than the previous options. The boy suggests deciding it with rock, paper, scissors, and the winner chooses the final name. At last, it becomes known that the name Carriers won. A stern guard at the arena entrance reads from a wooden board and solemnly announces the new team. Despite protests, the decision stands. The guard then announces that the first part of the exam will take place here in the arena, orders them to bring their own weapons and armor since the guild issues nothing, and lets the team continue. A circular arena opens before them. Spectators sit on the tiered benches, motionless as they wait for the spectacle. Majestic marble columns in Attic style reinforce the solemnity of the place. The crowd in the stands watches the girls as they enter the arena. Some watch closely, others hang out with friends and ignore the newcomers. Curious, Scarlet asks the guard who all these people are and what they are doing here. The guard calmly explains they are spectators who came to watch the exam because they have free time today. Looking around, Sai notices some in the audience placing bets on the outcomes, studying each participant's strengths to predict who will overcome the trials and who will fail. Nearby, he sees a table where people crowd, leaving money on a special tray and talking about their favorites. The gleam of gold coins shows how serious the betting is. Inwardly, he admits he didn't mean to make such a scene, but if people want to watch, it's fine, so he shrugs and follows the guard. A guard's loud shout snaps him out of his thoughts. He tells the examiner he has brought new candidates for testing. A short, stout man sits on a nearby bench, softly humming to himself and greedily finishing the food on the first plate. Several clean, empty bowls are already stacked beside him. With his hands on his hips, the young man assumes the heavy-set man is the examiner, but later realizes he is only an attendant and that he jumped to the wrong conclusion. When the old man turns, the young man sees not a small, mustached man, but a burly warrior who can take blows, though he doubts his own judgment. Grasping the sword's hilt, the man states his name and declares he will test the newcomers in the first practical trial. He explains that anything is allowed, including techniques, magic, and any skills. The main thing is to show strength. The old man calls for combat and waits for the first volunteer, nodding in challenge. Determined Runamilia steps forward, clenches her fists, and says she is ready to be the first to face the trial. Her eyes burn with a resolve that overcomes fear. Examining the girl, the examiner asks if she is recognized as a saint, and when she answers yes, he laughs in surprise because that is rare among young girls. He asks about her level and whether she has the holy arrow skill. Runamilia says she is level 20 and also has light, but can only use it on herself. The young man does not understand anything. The examiner says she will manage but forbids using holy energy. You can try as many times as you want. Runamilia nervously looks to her friend for support. Having drawn the bat hidden under her clothes, the girl takes a fighting stance, grips the weapon with both hands, and announces she is ready for the exam. The young man looks down, thinking everything will be fine. The girl has the strength and faith to overcome any challenge. He remembers the fight against a giant centipede when Runamilia knocked the monster down with one blow, and his confidence in her grows. Back then she did not use its full power. Now the bat glows, energy running along it and filling it with unseen strength. A storm gathers around the girl. Lightning threads through the air. The wind roars and magical energy trembles, ready to break free. Sitting to the side, the young man watches closely and wonders whether the old man will survive the blow, since Runamilia's power is overwhelming. The wind tosses the examiner's hair, but he stands perfectly still. With a smile, he says he hasn't seen such powerful magic in a long time. He taunts the saintly girl, daring her to hit him if she can. Her determination only grows, and she lunges forward. A blast hits the arena, sending up clouds of dust and debris, and the audience gasps as the nun and the old man disappear into the chaos. The girl tightens her grip on the handle, draws back, and drives all her strength into a strike aimed directly at the examiner. The man remains calm, with no hint of fear on his face. His confidence reveals genuine mastery. Torn with worry, the young man watches, now fearing not for Runamilia but for the frail old man, who could be crushed by such a blow. He unexpectedly sidesteps with a calm expression. The swing's power misses him, and the bat strikes empty air. Dust and whirlwinds kick up around him, but the examiner stands firm, one hand on his sword, the other clenched behind his back. The storm's force nearly sweeps the girls and the young man away. They stand stunned and speechless because no one expected a sight like this. Eyes closed and wearing a sly smile, the man says it was more a breeze than a storm because the strike missed its mark. His taunting only irritates his opponent. Hurt and shouting, Runamilia delivers wild, chaotic blows, but none touch the old man, who easily dodges each strike. The young man watches closely, studying the fight. He realizes the old man reads every move because the nunchaku strikes are too predictable. With a deafening scream, the girl raises her weapon above her head, trying to land a blow that cannot be avoided. A gust of wind and dust sweeps the arena, and even front-row spectators shield their faces with their hands from flying stones and debris. Horrified, Zophie and Scarlet watch as their fragile friend unleashes a hidden power while a fierce wind twists their faces and hair. Front-row spectators scream in horror and amazement. They ask one another what power this is, since no one has ever seen such a sight. Only he, sitting in his chair the whole time and carefully studying the fighting style, narrows his eyes into the cloud of dust and realizes the examiner managed to dodge even that devastating blow. When the curtain of dust finally clears, the silhouettes of the old man and the young nun appear. A blade rings as it is drawn from its sheath, and cold steel presses against Runamilia's exposed neck. One more moment, and the young woman's life could have been cut short. The examiner, calm and composed, praises the girl and says that it is enough, while Runamilia stands motionless, gripping the club and staring at the ground shattered by her strike, and at the cracks in the stone that did not disturb a single hair on the old man's head. Astonishment now shows not only on Nuni's face but also in Sei's eyes. It seemed such a powerful blow would have stunned anyone, yet it failed to break the examiner's defense. Zophie's and Scarlet's eyes widen even more as they realize how tough this trial is. Gasping, the nun lowers her head and tries to lift her weapon again, refusing to fall back, though sweat runs down her brow and her breathing is ragged, and the old man asks with concern whether she can still move because she looks completely exhausted. Her hands trembling with exhaustion, the girl tries to strike, but at that moment the examiner lightly taps the back of her neck with the blade, and the glancing blow makes Runamilia reel and nearly pass out. Clicking his tongue and raising an eyebrow, the man asks if she has any real combat experience, and a trembling voice replies that this is only her second time using the weapon, before which she relied solely on holy magic while traveling the labyrinth. Stunned by what he heard, the carrier realizes the fight with the giant centipede was the girl's first real battle. He hadn't suspected that at the time because her movements were confident and showed no hint of fear. The old man slides the sword back onto his belt and prepares to pass sentence. The nun has plenty of skill, but her lack of experience keeps him from judging her fully. Despite the power she showed, she failed the trial this time. The old man solemnly announces that Runamilia failed the test. She may try again only after gaining experience in dungeons and small battles. Silence fills the hall as his words echo. Gritting her teeth, Scarlet curls her hands into fists and barely holds back the urge to hit the examiner, firing insults in her head while Zophie says nothing, calmly sizing up the trials ahead with a serious stare. Brushing dust from his clothes, the examiner speaks to Nuni once more, advising her to return when she is more experienced and completely confident in her abilities. The girl can only sigh heavily and agree. The young man decides abilities mean nothing if you cannot prove them in real combat. Standing up and resting his hand on the chair's back, he warmly praises Runamilia and assures her she fought honorably. Instead of gratitude, the nun cried, convinced she had looked pitiful before everyone and especially before herself. But he smiled and said that was not true, that she had been incredible and should now work even harder and try again. When the girl sits down to rest on the chair the man had just left, Pride shows in his eyes. He knows that despite her lack of experience, Runamilia's power is immense, and after dungeon battles, she will become a formidable ally. Meanwhile, the arena is taking a break for repairs. The stone slabs were almost completely destroyed. Beavers in hard hats enter the hall and under the senior foreman's watch carry heavy blocks one by one to prepare the arena for the next fight. After the repairs are done, young assassin Zophie steps into the arena and proudly says it's her turn, and the examiner stands in the center and calmly asks her to show what she can do. Without a word, Zophie stares at the old man and slowly begins to fade away, while the examiner raises his eyebrows in surprise but stays still for now, watching closely. The girl's silhouette fades and then vanishes from view of the onlookers and the old man, who stands with his hand behind his back, clenched into a fist, clicks his tongue and says quietly, "Well, interesting." Sigh. Runamilia and Scarlet watch in surprise as their friend suddenly disappears, not understanding how it could happen. For the nun, the trick seems incredible because she has never seen anything like it, and Scarlet explains it is a special ability to hide one's presence. Then the examiner realizes he is facing a real assassin and instantly recognizes her distinctive technique. It would be too late for anyone else, but not for the old man with his experience. Zofia slips into the man's shadow, grips the dagger's hilt, edges closer preparing to strike his side or stomach, and leans forward to drive power into the blow. The old man had seen through her plan long ago. Drawing his sword, one precise move knocked the dagger from Zophie's hand and almost knocked her off her feet, proving her tricks did not work in the open arena. The assassin rolls her eyes in annoyance, acknowledging her failed attempt. Meanwhile, the old man catches the dagger in midair and carefully examines it, squinting as he studies the blade and hilt from every angle. He turns to the girl and says Zophie could have used throwing techniques, but she replies bitterly that after leaving the squad, her former comrades took all the throwing gear and left her with only this one dagger. The old man sighs, returns the weapon to the girl, tells her she failed this time, and advises her to come next time with better gear and to combine ranged attacks with close combat. Unfortunately, this is another defeat they have to accept, no matter how they wish it were different. The bearer, the nun, and the witch realize with surprise and irritation that none of them may be able to go any further. Scarlet Andrenard refuses to give up. Gathering her strength, she knows nothing is decided yet. As the top student at the Royal School of Magic, she is not used to defeat or doubt in her abilities. Tightly gripping the magic wand, she steps forward a few paces and announces that it is her turn, her gaze steady, her dress fluttering in the wind and her sleeves rolled up, clearly following her own plan. The old man asks her to show her abilities while she slowly circles the arena, studying it and choosing a favorable position. His words annoy Scarlet, and she sharply tells him not to tell her what to do. Finding the right spot, the sorceress turns to the examiner and warns him not to complain if he gets hurt. Confident in her advantage, and that she will perform far better than the others, the crystal atop the staff flares into a bright light, sending blinding rays across the arena as the girl raises her weapon higher and whispers a spell. At that moment, Zophie and Runamilia look at her in surprise, just as Scarlet once looked at them. A sudden gust of wind pins them down on the benches in the stands. Raising her staff high and gripping it tightly with both hands, the sorceress concentrates as powerful winds and glowing streams spiral around the crystal while she stands unmoved, ready to attack. Spectators watch closely as fire and wind sweep across the arena. No one closes their eyes or shouts, unlike during the nuns' fight. They are absorbed by the spectacle. The examiner stays calm, watching how skillfully the girl controls her magic. Not everyone can do that, and it is impressive. A huge fireball rises over the arena, radiating heat all around. Ignoring praise she does not need, Scarlet breathes out steadily and completes the spell. A huge sphere blazes under her control as she puts all her strength into it, concentrating the energy in one spot. With the orb guided by her wand, the young sorceress lifts it higher and looks at the old man, and though the magical sphere seems about to burst, it obeys her completely. She strengthens her creation, adding smaller fiery clusters around it like meteors, and directs them toward the calm elder who remains motionless, only waiting for the right moment. A huge sphere she created earlier follows the small fireballs, and she guides it with her staff as it rushes toward the old man, heating the air. The examiner confronts the academy's most powerful magic. Small side orbs leave fiery trails, and a huge central sphere blinds and scorches with its heat. The crowd is stunned and feels for the old man, realizing he cannot dodge this time. Men shout that the girl will not hold back, and her friends watch in horror at the madness of that ball. Scarlet's eyes burn with absolute confidence, convinced of her superiority, and she shouts that the man has nowhere left to run while watching without pity as the spells chase him. The old man stays silent, only mumbles hoarsely, clicks his scabbard and draws his sword. His sharp swing cuts the air with incredible speed, meeting the fiery onslaught. In an instant, he deflects one projectile with his sword, steps forward as a giant ball hits the ground behind him, kicking up clouds of smoke and scattering sparks across the arena. Calmly, he notes to himself that wooden practice swords are no match for that force, because they snap immediately and can injure the wielder unless reinforced by a special technique. The secret is to charge the blade with magic and touch the fireball briefly, which is enough to set its course and divert the fiery projectile to a chosen spot, avoiding harm. A man deflects every bullet fired at him, touching each with his sword and redirecting the shots so none hit him or the spectators in the stands. The crowd erupts in cheers, not believing what they see, and someone shouts angrily that the old man cuts through bullets faster than anyone can follow with their eyes. It seems impossible. A spectator suddenly spots a huge ball hurtling straight down and calls out a warning. Then the man plants his sword in a stone slab, lifts it, and touches the ball with it to deflect its impact. The slab lifts with the sword, holding a giant fiery projectile. The man could not redirect it further to prevent anyone in the hall from being hurt by its force. Gasping in amazement, Scarlet watches as the bullet explodes high in the sky, leaving black smoke and fragments of a stone slab. And for her it means defeat, because the old man remained unharmed. As the smoke clears, a man steps towards Scarlet and praises her incredible power. For such a young sorceress, her combat skills, strategy, and courage are impressive and consistently exceptional. At last, he announces that the girl passed the trial and became the first to overcome the task. Scarlet freezes in stunned silence, tightening her grip on her weapon. After regaining her senses, she calls the old man a madman, and the crowd breaks into applause, congratulating Scarlet on her victory in passing the test. Zofia and Runa warmly congratulate her on her success. The nun says she expected nothing less from the academy's best student. The old man just waves it off, muttering that it's too much fuss over a routine check. Now it's Size's turn, the last contender of the day. He feels awkward under everyone's gaze, but tries to push aside distracting thoughts as he steps into the arena. The examiner prepares to start the inspection, but spots a baggage handler badge on the boy's chest, which makes him smile, and the spectators in the stands notice it too. The crowd bursts into laughter, calling the boy a weakling and joking that someone so frail isn't even fit for bronze rank, and they see it as a ridiculous stunt. Only his companions remain serious. The assassin and the sorceress watch the stands with contempt, while Rune Amelia looks on with gentle admiration, hands clasped in prayer. She truly believes he will win. Sai says sarcastically that the old man should not be surprised the porter wants the bronze rank, but the examiner shakes his head and says the boy himself is mistaken. It isn't Sai wanting a rank that surprises him. It's that a man like that worked as a carrier. The boy only adjusts his gloves, stays silent, and prepares for the decisive duel. Laughter rolls through the stands, and if not long ago spectators feared the girl's strength and admitted their power, now an ordinary carrier draws only mockery and the impression that this is a ridiculous show. The old heavyset man repeats that he is surprised Sai could be a carrier, and he is not wrong, because though he lacks the skill to judge, he has something more valuable, a hardened veteran's instinct. Adjusting his glasses on the tip of his nose, the man notes that veteran warriors learn to sense an enemy's strength. Sai watches silently, preparing for the duel. The young man draws his sword, holding the scabbard in one hand and the hilt in the other, and says he will accept the examiner's final verdict only after the fight. Laughter fills the arena again. The nimblest taunt that his sword drills deserve only scorn. Everyone is sure he will be on the ground in 3 seconds. Gripping the handle, The boy keeps his emotions in check and ignores the insults. They call him mad, but Sai vows to prove them wrong and wipe the smiles off their faces. Despite the taunts, he fills his sword with magic, concentrating power in his hands. The blade shines with bright light, and a trail of fire runs along its edge. The examiner studies him more closely. Native users rarely show mana control, but Sai is different, and his precise, economical use of enhancement magic makes a strong impression. The young man smiles ominously and asks if that will be enough to pass the trial. The old man only smiles back. A guard tosses the examiner a new sword after the previous one broke fighting Scarlet. The old man catches it, takes a stance, and prepares to begin the duel. Gripping the hilt, he says that although Saya's mana control and his enhancements are impressive, they are not enough to defeat true monsters, and the fight will reveal the truth. The boy and the old man cross swords. Sai steps forward. The examiner clenches his fist behind his back and says he is ready to see Sai's strength. The fight begins. The crowd around the arena is growing. More people gather and whisper, asking what is happening. Sai's friends watch hopefully to make sure the noise does not disturb the young man. Gritting his teeth, the young man realizes he can't reveal all his cards to the crowd, so he must hold back. Barely moving his lips, he whispered, "Let's begin." Sai attacks head-on, his sword flashing with blinding light, but the examiner parries the strike and steps aside, staying out of reach. Gathering himself, the young man strikes so hard the old man almost loses his balance, but still blocks the next swing and avoids the blow. Sai keeps his focus on his opponent, steps back and lands a few more strikes. The old man calmly parries them, standing firm like a rock. The boy's face hardens, showing his resolve to see it through, and he leans back after a parry, drags his sword along the ground, kicking up sparks and dust, and drops to one knee. The young man snaps to his feet and scans the arena, trying to make a clear plan of attack and choose which side to strike from, since a direct assault, as he has already learned, does not win and leaves him no chance. Leaping up at the old man, he swings with all his strength at the right side of his torso, but the examiner calmly parries the series of strikes, blocking each one without even looking at his persistent opponent. At that moment, the old man tries to strike back, but the boy slides on his knees across the ground and leans his head back, avoiding a deadly swing that could easily have sliced his neck or head. Gathering himself quickly, he assumes a fighting stance again, raises the sword's hilt closer to his face and swings sharply from the left, but the old man anticipates the move and calmly steps aside. Swords cross again, metal rings, but the examiner's strike is much stronger now. If before he only dodged, now he goes on the offensive and counterattacks. The boy is knocked farther back by the force, but the old man immediately rushes after him and swings again, and anger and resolve flash in the youth's eyes as the back and forth of blows starts to irritate him, and he wants to win at any cost. The sword slips from the young man's hand and is knocked away as he hurtles into the opposite corner of the arena while the examiner prepares his next blow. The old man steps forward and breaks into another run, but the youth manages to recover his sword. Grabbing his weapon at the last moment, he parries the strike and counterattacks. His sword shoots up, and with a powerful sweep knocks the examiner's blade aside, after which the boy lunges forward in a swift, driving assault. Swinging his sword left and right, the boy comes up with a new tactic, forcing the old man to lower his swings and shorten his strikes. Then he chooses a moment and lunges forward, dust kicking up under his feet and sparks flying. Rushing at the old man at crazy speed, the boy moves behind him and tries to strike, but the examiner blocks the attack again. The examiner admits the boy hits hard and accurately, but his eyes give away his intent before he swings. Those words enrage the young man even more. He kicks the old man's face with all his force, but the old man raises a hand to block the blow and says dryly that it's not a bad try for a young fighter. Running on empty and gasping, the young man clutches his sword and wipes sweat from his brow. His eyes lock on the old man, and he no longer knows where to strike to even touch him and earn the coveted bronze rank. The old man swings his sword slowly and, without effort, smugly says he is not even sweating. He tells the young man to drop all hesitation and strike with full force, because whenever the old man deliberately leaves an opening, the boy has a moment of doubt. The examiner continues, explaining this is a harmful habit that must be rooted out. The porter has something others do not have, a hidden advantage, an ace up his sleeve that he himself has not yet learned to use properly. The young man attacks again, but the old man, still talking, easily deflects every strike and concludes the youth's movements are too chaotic and meaningless. The examiner notices 7 times in a row that the young man shifts his weight before a strike, an unnecessary move that, in the examiner's view, shows he is not confident despite trying to appear so. One blow is enough to knock the porter down again and leave him off balance, while the old man keeps reporting that Sei has several attack plans at once and they all merge into chaos. The old man asks if he is judging correctly, but that is mostly rhetorical. The young man pictures victory and sees himself landing the decisive blow, yet all those images disappear the moment the examiner issues a new challenge. The crowd and the boy's companions are stunned. Spectators are amazed that the porter is still standing and hasn't fallen because the fight seems to have lasted forever, and the girls notice the examiner is getting more serious and that this match is nothing like the previous ones. The old man notices the boy handles the sword with finesse and guesses he was born into a noble or even knightly family. The youth's eyes widen in surprise and the guess throws him off balance. Clenching the sword with incredible force, the old man studies the youth closely, letting his fingers glide along the silver blade and noting that such fine decoration belongs only to the aristocracy of Amberius. Suspicious, he wonders how a noble's weapon ended up in a common man's hands, and the words stir painful memories in the young man. So the youth rushes forward to silence the voice of the past. Gripping the sword with his other hand, the boy launches a sharp, angry lunge, and for the first time manages to graze the old man, cutting a few strands of gray hair from his head. The stands erupt in amazed shouts. One more moment and the strike would have landed. The girl with twin tails shouts about the incredible speed, and the other cannot tell where the boy's sword went. The hero's heart now burns with more than the goal of earning a bronze rank. It holds a fierce urge to win, even to kill, and he prepares for the decisive confrontation. Suddenly, everything ends. The old man sheathes his sword, smiles, and congratulates the boy on passing the test, his stern face softening into a friendly expression. The young man froze, not believing what he heard, still gripping the blade in his hand as the stands thundered with applause and joyful shouts, celebrating his victory. Rising slowly, he shakes his head, and the elder explains that the boy's strength surpassed all expectations, though the young man believes his victory was granted. In fact, the hero is wrong, because behind the mentor's calm, indifferent mask, a storm was raging, and he could barely keep from panicking during the fight. The old man assures that this experience will be priceless in the future, and says he will not pry into other people's secrets, so the young man can be at ease. To encourage the boy, he shares his own truth that a weapon alone is nothing, just a tool, and victory depends on the skill of the one who uses it. He says that by watching an opponent's breathing, movements, and posture, you can predict their actions and become an unbeatable warrior even without extraordinary strength. Whoever grasps this simple truth will make everything around them a weapon. Their power will surpass all limits and classes, and such warriors will be shown the world's secrets. The title of a mere bearer carries no weight, because a whole new path opens up before the young man, and he returns to his friends who are overjoyed for him. Rune Amelia showers him with praise, saying he exceeded all her expectations and warmly congratulates him on his victory in battle and on passing the exam. But the young man, frowning, mumbles that the old man had been tricking him the whole time, and continues thoughtfully replaying every moment of the fight and the words he heard. Scarlet proudly announces she passed the trial herself, while Runa Amelia bows her head in quiet defeat as she recalls her own loss. The hero encourages her, assuring that dungeon experience will earn her more than bronze, and that he will always be by her side watching her grow. The girl blushes at his passionate words, whispering that he is a true apostle to her, though the young man does not understand her words and her friends only exchange surprised looks. Smiling softly, he says there's nothing special about him, that he's only a simple bearer, not a knight and certainly not an angel from heaven. The nun ignores his words, chuckles softly, folds her hands, and assures him she understands and will simply pretend she noticed nothing, beaming with a happiness that seems odd to the hero. To change the subject, the young man says that from now on, as fellow adventurers, he may call her simply Runemelia without formal titles, and she looks at him, puzzled. Embarrassed, She waves her hands, stumbles over her words, calls him an apostle, then corrects herself to say, insisting he call her not dryly Runamilia, but gently and briefly Rune. Smiling with satisfaction, the young man promises to call her by the name she asks, and gently says Rune, which finally overwhelms the nun and fills her with sweet delight. At last they reach the guild's main foyer, where a crowd surrounds them on all sides. The assassin is annoyed by the attention, while Scarlet beams with joy. Laughing, she praises her own feat because her brilliant performance on the exam now guarantees high demand, and every team will want such a valuable, charming ally. The crowd's interest isn't limited to Scarlet. Men surround Runamilia, openly staring at her chest and commenting on its size, making her feel embarrassed. Sophie was surrounded too. The men looked her over, noting her fragile frame and pale skin, praising her pretty looks and promising to teach her many useful things on their teams. The witch enjoys the attention most of all, as men praise her figure, invite her to join them, promise potions for fun, and claim that with her they could defeat even dungeon bosses. Suddenly, Sophie steps forward and declares time is up, ordering the hungry dogs to back off, keep their distance, and stop greedily clinging to the girls. The girls come over to say and hug him, and even Sophie, despite secretly enjoying the attention, stays loyal and says they all belong to the porter, and that must be taken into account. Her words surprise men and women and even the hero, but he stays calm and confirms he will join only teams that won't touch his wives. The crowd pulls back, squad leaders head off to their duties, the girls grumble, and Runamilia looks at her apostle, surprised and blushing, not understanding what he meant. Suddenly, Scarlet grabs the man by the throat, squeezes so his veins bulge, and demands an explanation why he thought she was his wife or would ever be. Say tries to calm her, explaining he only did it to scare off the ruffians, and Sophie adds that those men only wanted to use the girls, not fight the monsters. A voice comes from the shadows, and a friendly young man with short hair steps forward, asks if he is truly the leader of the carrier's team, and offers to join forces. The young man doesn't rush to answer, puts his hand on his hip, and notes that the stranger immediately recognized him as a leader, even though he thought he looked awkward in that role. The boy convinces him that a porter is vital on dungeon expeditions and says he has been in the guild for 3 years, during which his squad gained a lot of experience. After a brief introduction, Say says he is the carrier team's leader, and the other man turns out to be Rock, head of the investigative squad, and they shake hands in respect. The hero wonders if Rock has already cleared the dungeon, since his team likely defeated several guards, and Rock smiles and confirms, naming a leopard Nuta, a mystical goat, a fan-shaped eagle, and a giant sand crab. Rock openly boasts that in 3 years they have defeated 4 dungeon guards and now aim for a fire-breathing salamander, but some problems have temporarily put the quest on hold. Runamilia can hardly believe the squad killed 4 guards, since they are incredibly powerful beings, and Scarlet pouts as she asks about the last guard, confirming that after him only the dungeon master remains. Rock explains that the Lotus Labyrinth is vast and the guards constantly patrol their territory. So even with intel, finding them is mostly luck, because searches can take months, which is why strategy and the right weapons matter more than chance. The monsters can be defeated, but Rock's squad lost many fighters in the battles, so now they are gathering detailed information about the monsters and the cave to prepare better and avoid repeating past mistakes. According to Say, in that case the carrier's role becomes even more important. Rock observes approvingly that the young man instantly grasps the point. He says their team always plans carefully, turns knowledge into fighting strength, and cuts down time wasted on reconnaissance. They stand out from other units by focusing mainly on training. Rock does not hide his admiration for Say's courage during the trial. That kind of potential is very unusual for a carrier, and makes the boy especially interesting. Say sighs that even then nobody believed in him and everyone was betting against him. Rock admits he also bet on his loss, and the boy is a bit hurt, but thanks him for being honest. Putting betting aside, the young man concludes that since he and his friends are beginners, teaming up with experienced people is the best option and their chance to learn. Smiling, Rock agrees and says he is always ready to answer any questions from him or his team. This is how their collaboration begins. Night is falling outside. After a full day, Runemilia, Say, Zophie, and Scarlet return home to rest and regain their strength. Zophie pulls her hair into a ponytail and, standing in a thin nightgown that reveals her body, asks Say if new acquaintances can really be trusted. Lying on the bed with his hands behind his head, the guy asks whether they're talking about Rock's squad and says that working with experienced people can only help. Sitting on the soft bed, she says their lives will now depend on that command and asks again if he is sure of his decision, since they have always acted on their own before. Say says these people are more trustworthy than the crazy ones in the guild. Simple folks are easy to read, but those who stand out too much are the most dangerous. The young man says the only true protection is a weapon in your own hands, because the deeper you go into the dungeon, the darker people's hearts grow, and for now they should enjoy the new experience. Since tomorrow they face their first venture into the prison. Remembering another important point, Say pulls out 4 black throwing knives for Zophie, recalling how her weapons had been taken and only a small dagger remained. Sitting between his legs, the girl studies the blades with admiration and says they are exceptionally well made. He explains they were forged by a black ironsmith mage, so they are unique weapons. After removing the target, the young man tells her these knives are handy in both close combat and at range, and now she can use them in any situation. After setting the target, he suggests they practice. Zophie agrees, climbs up toward the ceiling, and throws knives one after another, hitting the center every time. She accepts only perfection. All the knives hit the target dead center. The impact throws her off the bed and she falls to the floor, spinning a little, but even then she manages to throw a few more blades and still hit. Training continues, but now Say is the target. He deflects blows with a frying pan lying nearby and wraps his fist with a sturdy rope. While Zophie is distracted, the young man manages to toss a rope at her feet and she falls onto the bed. Not upset, she looks up, smiles, and says he is really strong, just as she expected. He shakes his head, admitting he has a long way to go before he can be someone she can trust to watch her back. And Zophie immediately teases him, calling him weak and saying those words will come back to haunt her. After pulling the girl by the shoulders, Say settles her between his legs, cups her delicate breasts, and begins to caress them, squeezing and stroking, saying she can keep the front line. The squabbles turn into sweet sighs. Gasping between quiet moans, Zophia still manages to ask in a trembling voice how much he paid for the new weapon. Hair falls across her face, her sweaty body trembles and beads of sweat roll down her chin. Smiling, Say says a young woman's body will make up for everything. Zophie laughs, jokingly calls him a pervert, and he does not even deny it. In a room lit only by moonlight, intimacy sparks between them. They merge in a single rush of passion, sparing neither themselves nor time. Bodies and souls fuse through the night. The young man does not stop, taking what is his, and the young woman yields willingly, reaching out so he can grab her hands and make another powerful thrust. In the dark, by the glow of a lamp holding a candle, Rock sits at a table and carefully writes with a quill on paper, a troubled smile crossing his face that no one understands. The next morning, with the sun already up, the heroes head to the guild building. Atlantean knights with swords stand at the entrance, and the facade is decorated with columns and urns of flowers and shrubs. Ahead lies the unknown, but they move forward without fear.